Hey guys, tonight we begin in the quiet blue before dawn, where the mist curls low across the water and the world still feels half asleep. You're sitting in a small canoe, drifting between narrow green paths that look like long, sleepy islands but are, in fact, floating gardens, chinampas. The lake is mirror still, reflecting the ghost of a distant volcano and the frayed outline of willow trees that mark the edges of these artificial plots. Your paddle barely ripples the surface. The air is cool, damp, and smells of wet earth, crushed reeds, and the faint sweetness of blooming squash blossoms. A bird cries once, then silence returns. It's peaceful here, strange, maybe, but deeply peaceful. And yet, this serene, floating world is the backbone of a civilization. You're in the Aztec capital region, surrounded by farmland that shouldn't work and somehow thrives anyway. It's beautiful, it's clever, it's a little soggy, and it might be your job to weed it by hand until your legs fall asleep. You probably won't survive this. But that's okay, we're not here to survive. We're here to relax. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling friendly, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lift your paddle again and drift gently forward. The chinampas stretch ahead like green fingers. On each one, rows of crops sleep beneath morning haze. Amaranth, beans, maize, squash, chili. Nothing mechanical stirs. There are no oxen, no plows. Just canoes, mud, trees, and water. You start to understand that the Aztecs didn't conquer the swamp, they invited it to dinner. They asked politely, they made it useful. Let's pause here and zoom out just a little. The Valley of Mexico, where this all unfolds, was once a patchwork of lakes and volcanic mountains, dotted with small islands and marshes that defied easy settlement. But humans, being stubborn and inventive, figured out how to make it work. The Aztecs, especially, were good at working with extremes. And when they arrived in this place, Lake Texcoco, with its salty heart and fresh water edges, they saw not an obstacle, but a potential farm. Only problem? That farm was underwater. And so they began to build gardens that didn't sit on the land, but on the lake. They didn't drain the swamp. They grew food on top of it. Here's your core historical fact. Chinampas were not technically floating in the way a raft floats, but they were anchored garden platforms built up with layers of mud, lake sediment, decaying vegetation, and woven reed mats, reinforced with tree roots and bordered by canals. These plots were incredibly fertile, produced high yields year-round, and were ingeniously irrigated by the very waters they rested on. They were one of the most productive agricultural innovations in Mesoamerican history. The Spanish were baffled when they saw them. But you, today, are just a sleepy farmer sliding a paddle through the fog. You reach your chinampa. It's narrow, maybe 25 feet across and 200 feet long. It's edged with ahuejote trees, willows that keep the edges in place with their deep, water-hungry roots. The garden smells alive, not just plant alive, but lake alive. Frogs croak in the undergrowth. A dragonfly buzzes across your path. Somewhere in the maize rows, a small lizard scrambles for cover. You reach down, scoop a handful of lake mud, and watch it ooze between your fingers. It's rich, dark, slightly warm. You'll be kneeling in this for hours. And here's your delightfully weird detail. The mud used to build and maintain chinampas was often hauled up from the lake bottom using long-handled scoopers that resembled rakes crossed with baskets. In Nahuatl, one name for this sediment was tezcadlali, which roughly translates to mirror soil. Poetic, right? It was called that because of its glistening texture and high fertility, and yes, it was sometimes used as a cosmetic, applied to the skin before festivals. Dirt, but make it chic. As you kneel beside your first row of beans, the sun starts to break through the mist. Light spills across the garden like warm water. You can see Tenochtitlan rising in the distance. Stone temples catching fire in the dawn light. Smoke drifting upward from breakfast fires. The soft blur of movement as the city begins to stretch and stir. Somewhere, a drum taps slowly. You feel it in your bones. And now, a scholarly debate for your drowsy brain. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs were the first to invent chinampa farming, or whether they inherited the system from earlier Mesoamerican cultures like the Xochimilca or Teotihuacanos. The evidence is patchy, and the chinampas themselves don't leave behind easy archaeological trails. After all, they're made of mud. But most agree the Aztecs refined the practice to its most efficient, most widespread form, eventually using it to feed hundreds of thousands of people. You start your work for the day, loosening soil around the roots with your fingers, checking for pests, whispering a soft apology to the squash you accidentally stepped on. The sun is rising faster now, and the garden is waking. Herons stalk the edges of the canal, peering into the water. A turtle slides from one mudbank into the shade. Your fingers are coated in black silt, and a mosquito has decided your earlobe looks like lunch. You wave it away half-heartedly. This, somehow, is a miracle. Not in the flashy, thunderbolt from the gods kind of way. But in the quiet, patient, we've turned water into supper kind of way. Chinampas didn't just grow food. They grew sustainability. They proved that even in a swampy basin with seasonal floods, unstable soil, and unpredictable weather, life could be not only possible, but plentiful. They showed that cooperation with the land could feed an empire. And all it takes, really, is mud, sticks, roots, and a willingness to get your knees dirty. You sit back on your heels and breathe in the garden. Dragonflies hover. The lake sparkles. Your toes are wet. The sun is warm on your scalp. And somewhere in the distance, a canoe glides by with a bundle of maize flowers and a child humming an old, slow tune. Welcome to the garden. You've been squatting on the edge of the garden bed for an hour now, mud caked to your calves, fingertips black with sediment, the soft ache of routine settling deep into your spine. And while the morning fog has burned away to a bright, sun-washed stillness, you're starting to ask a very reasonable question. Why on earth would anyone go to this much trouble to build a farm on water? Wouldn't it have been easier to just plant on, land? You're not the first person to ask. But to understand the answer, you have to understand Lake Texcoco. Which wasn't exactly the kind of lake you bring a picnic to. Here's the honest truth. Lake Texcoco was, by and large, a mess. It was shallow, sprawling, and, in many places, painfully salty. So much so that its central basin was undrinkable and unusable for most crops. It behaved badly during rainy seasons, often flooding the shorelines and turning farmland to muck. But the Aztecs, like the gardeners before them, weren't deterred by this. They didn't flee the lake's chaos. They leaned in. They adapted. And here's your core historical fact. The Chinampa system was a brilliant workaround to the limitations of unstable, saline soil. Rather than trying to control the water entirely, which would have meant endless draining, walling, and patching, the Aztecs developed a system of semi-floating plots built up above the lake's surface. These floating gardens weren't just practical, they were a direct response to a landscape that refused to be tamed. The more the lake rebelled, the more ingenious the gardeners became. You crouch beside your next row of chili peppers, nestled low to the earth, their glossy green leaves trembling in the breeze. You glance at the canal beside the bed, which glistens with duckweed and dragonflies, and try to imagine what this place looked like before the Chinampas. Just a blanket of marshland, full of reeds, fish, insects, and endless soggy frustration. And then someone got the idea. What if we made the land ours, one basket of mud at a time? That's how it began. Layer by layer, basket by basket, the earliest Chinampa builders would pile sediment, lake muck, and vegetation into long, rectangular plots. These plots were framed with wooden stakes, often made from willow or cypress, and anchored with live saplings that would eventually take root and help stabilize the whole thing. Once raised above water level, the beds were topped with rich silt from the lake bottom and composted plant matter from shorelines. Within weeks, the soil was teeming with life. Within months, they were planting. Now here's your fringe historical detail. The Aztecs used a substance called tequixquitl, a kind of alkaline lakebed deposit, to mix with soil and enrich it, despite the fact that it smelled faintly of rotten fish and had the consistency of cold porridge. Farmers often dug it with wide, flat paddles and layered it in alternating stripes with more organic matter, creating a kind of muddy lasagna that somehow worked like magic. As you scoop out a handful of that same black soil now, rich, dark, sticky, you notice how little effort it takes to break it apart. This is no dry, cracked earth. This is earth that breathes. The kind of earth that gives generously, if you know how to ask. And that brings us to an open scholarly question. Historians still argue whether Chinampa construction was a centralized state-run effort or a community-based, cooperative tradition. Some records suggest local families managed their own plots, passing them down like heirlooms. Others point to temple registries and tribute lists, implying higher levels of control. It may have been a bit of both, a blend of communal labor, sacred duty, and political management that kept the whole lake blooming. You pause to stretch your back. The canoe you paddled in on floats gently at the edge of the canal, tied to a willow branch. Nearby, a turtle suns itself on a half-submerged log, barely moving except for the slow blink of a contented eye. The wind picks up just enough to rustle the rows of maize in the next bed, their tall stalks swaying like temple dancers. It's easy to forget, looking at all this, that you're standing in the middle of a lake. That the ground beneath you is suspended by tree roots, twine, and the stubbornness of centuries. And yet here you are. Here's another quirky insight for your night-bound brain. Chinampas were so efficient that they could yield up to 7 harvests a year. This was thanks to the naturally self-irrigating design, the rich lake sediment, and the mild climate of the Valley of Mexico. Farmers staggered their planting cycles, meaning something was always growing, always ripening, always ready to pluck. If you were lucky and smart, you might never go hungry. But luck, of course, wasn't enough. The work was constant. Even now, you can hear other farmers moving through the beds. The soft thump of a paddle, the creak of a reed basket, the distant murmur of voices, trading gossip and weather predictions. Everyone is in motion, like bees in a watery hive. There's something soothing about it. something humble. The labor isn't grand, it's not dramatic, but it's endless, and it's what kept a city of hundreds of thousands alive. As you move to the next patch of soil, your knees squelch gently into the mud. A heron stalks the shallows nearby, eyeing you warily before returning its focus to a school of tiny fish. In the distance, the skyline of Tenochtitlan gleams faintly, its pyramids catching the sun like sharpened teeth. But out here, there are no priests, no merchants, no warriors. Just you, your hands, your plants, and the miracle of mud that never quite sinks, never quite floats, and always manages to grow something green. You lean back slightly, wipe your hands on your robe, and feel a quiet pride rise in your chest, not flashy, not heroic, but solid. You've helped build something not with bricks, but with trust in the earth. Something that's messy and damp and glorious. Something that turns water into corn. Something that understands what it means to begin again every morning and grow something anyway. You wake up the next morning with soil still under your nails, and a faint ache in your thighs from crouching too long in yesterday's rows of chili peppers. A thin mist still hovers over the lake like a breath that hasn't been exhaled. Your canoe waits where you left it, tied to a willow pole, swaying lazily against the soft lap of water. You step in, push off with your paddle, and begin to glide across the canal toward your chinampa again, already thinking about what needs tending, what needs harvesting, and, perhaps most pressingly, how this garden came to exist at all. It didn't rise from the lake overnight, after all. Chinampas weren't found, they were built, piece by piece, in a process that was slow, squishy, and frankly not very glamorous. Picture it. A patch of shallow lake, filled with reeds and rushes, too muddy to walk on but not deep enough to navigate cleanly. You don't start by planting. You start by weaving. First, you take bundles of reeds, usually tule or carrizo, and lash them together into rafts, layering them with smaller sticks and brushwood until they form a mat thick enough to float, but only just. Then comes the mud, buckets and buckets of it, dredged up from the lake bed with long-handled scoopers. It smells briny, rich, and faintly fishy. You slop it over the raft, spreading it by hand until the surface darkens and sags. Then you repeat the process. More reeds, more mud, more time. And then you wait, because this isn't just a raft you're building. It's a living thing. Here's your historical centerpiece. The construction of a chinampa often began with outlining a rectangle in shallow water using wooden stakes, typically from fast-growing ahuejote trees. These were planted vertically at regular intervals, forming a perimeter around the garden to be. Over time, the trees would take root and serve not only as anchors but also as windbreaks and shade for the crops. Between these borders, the reeds and mud were piled up, layer upon layer, until a raised, semi-stable platform emerged from the lake like a soggy miracle. You arrive at your own chinampa now and jump ashore with a practiced hop. The bed feels springy underfoot, alive, almost. Your footsteps leave gentle impressions that slowly rise back into shape. The ahuejotes that mark the corners of your plot sway slightly, their branches catching the sun in soft green flashes. You pause to touch the bark of one, a habit you've picked up. A way of saying thank you to the thing that's holding your entire morning together. And here's a fringe tidbit that doesn't get enough love. Some chinampa builders used dead fish as a foundational layer, buried beneath the reeds and mud to provide a burst of nutrients. This wasn't just smart composting. It was also symbolic. Fish were seen as gifts from the lake, and returning them to the soil was a kind of exchange, a quiet thank you that kept the system running. The smell, though? Let's just say your neighbors knew when you were building a new bed. As you kneel by your squash vines and begin to prune the leaves, you wonder how long it took for the first gardener to realize this worked. That mud and sticks and trees could become something stable, something fertile. It must have been slow, frustrating, maybe even laughable, and yet they kept at it. They trusted the method. They built an ecosystem where there had only been murk, and in doing so, they changed not just their farms, but their world. You glance at the waterline. It's high today, there must have been rain upriver. But your chinampa doesn't flinch. The trees hold, the mud stays firm, the water licks the edge but doesn't rise over it. That's the beauty of this design, it adapts. It floats just enough to survive, sinks just enough to stay. And here's the debate for today's brain itch. Historians still argue whether chinampas were originally engineered as floating islands or whether they evolved from modified marshlands that were gradually elevated and stabilized. Some archaeologists suggest the early versions were little more than soggy platforms that had to be rebuilt constantly, while others point to evidence of complex earthworks and submerged canals suggesting a deliberate, long-term vision. Either way, it worked. The fact that chinampas are still functioning in parts of Xochimilco today tells you all you need to know. You finish pruning the squash, wipe your hands on your tunic, and sit for a moment on the edge of the canal. The willow trees above you creak softly in the breeze. A heron glides low across the water, then lands near a cluster of reeds, its neck folding in on itself like a silk ribbon. You breathe in the scent of damp earth, sun-warmed leaves, and a faint trace of wood smoke drifting from the far end of the lake. Somewhere, another farmer calls to his child in Nahuatl, their voices echoing across the still surface. It's in these moments, quiet, mud-streaked, tender, that you begin to understand why this system endured. Why it fed a city. Why it lasted centuries. It wasn't just about food. It was about relationship, between water and land, between human hands and stubborn mud, between patience and reward. A chinampa doesn't scream success. It doesn't sparkle. It simply works. It yields. It remains. You run your fingers through the soil again, feeling the damp weight of it, the roots curling through it like veins. It's not glamorous, but it's real, and it's ready to feed you. You rise, brush off your knees, and walk the length of the bed to check your amaranth seedlings. A canoe glides past in the canal beside you, and the farmer aboard lifts 2 fingers in greeting before disappearing into the willow shade. You don't speak. You don't need to. You're both part of the same slow, squishy, brilliant rhythm. Your chinampa holds firm beneath your feet. And tomorrow, it will do the same. By the time the sun climbs past its highest point and begins its long, golden lean toward evening, your chinampa has grown warm and fragrant. The scent of sun-warmed squash leaves, bruised basil, and damp earth thickens in the air. You kneel beside your maize stalks now, one hand resting on the cool soil, the other reaching for a fist-sized ball of gray-brown clay. It's dense, sticky, and cool to the touch, pulled straight from the canal earlier this morning. You press it carefully into the base of a new ahuejote sapling, patting it gently into place. A thin stake stands beside the tree, tied loosely with twisted fibers. This is not planting. This is anchoring, reinforcing, giving your garden legs. Because if there's one truth you've learned by now, it's that chinampas aren't just floating soil, they're engineered structures. And like anything suspended in an unpredictable world of water, they need reinforcement. Lots of it. This brings us to the unsung heroes of the floating gardens: mud bricks, tree stakes, and, when all else failed, long lines of woven reed rope. Chinampas may seem delicate when viewed from above, just soft garden beds surrounded by still canals, but beneath that surface lies a world of dense layering and strategic design. The beds had to be firm enough to walk on, flexible enough to move with the water's seasonal shifts, and resilient enough not to break apart after heavy rain. No small feat when your entire foundation is soggy lakebed and enthusiastic ducks. Here's your core historical insight. Ahuejote trees were critical to Chinampa stability. These native willows had long, water-thirsty roots that thrived along the plot edges, helping bind the raised soil together and anchor it through seasonal floodwaters. Their canopies offered shade, their bark supplied raw material for cords and baskets, and their presence, row upon row, gave the Chinampa landscape its signature look. Orderly green lanes hemmed in by rustling verticals. You pause in your work and lean back slightly, your palm flat against the warm surface of the Chinampa. The soil is springy beneath you, but not loose. The structure holds. And that's because underneath this dark loam is an intricate sandwich of materials. Layers of reeds, grass, clay, brushwood, and lake silt stacked until the platform could resist being swallowed by the water that cradled it. And here's your fringe detail, equal parts resourceful and a little weird. In times of shortage, some gardeners used compacted algae as a soil stabilizer. Yes, algae. The Aztecs harvested spirulina, tecuitlatl, not just for food and pigment but occasionally to reinforce their soil layers. When mixed with dried reeds and compressed into mats, it could form a surprisingly durable base layer for fragile Chinampas. Was it a little stinky? Sure, but if it kept your beans from drowning, you made peace with the smell. As you walk along the edge of your garden, you inspect the tree-lined perimeter. The willows sway gently, their long fingers brushing the water's surface. The corners of the bed are squared off by thicker trunks, older trees that have been here longer than you've been alive. You run a hand along the bark, feeling the striations like ancient handwriting. These trees are more than decoration. They are pillars. Without them, the beds collapse. You dip your hand into the canal, letting the water run over your wrist. It's cooler than the air now, tinged with the scent of wet vegetation. You pull up a clump of tangled roots and silt and smear a handful onto a patch of soil beginning to sag. It's not glamorous work, but it's effective. These little repairs, mud here, a rock there, a retied knot at the edge, are what keep the Chinampa alive. Because left unattended, it can drift, erode, collapse inward like a tired sponge. You can't ever forget that these beds are not fixed land. They're constructs, in every sense. Now let's get into the debate of the day. Historians still argue whether Chinampa reinforcement methods were standardized across the empire or left to local experimentation. Some archaeological evidence suggests a consistent pattern of construction: similar stake depths, uniform bed widths, prescribed spacing. Others believe each plot reflected the character and craft of its keeper. Some meticulously squared, others improvisational, held together with a mix of genius and desperation. The truth may lie somewhere in between. In a civilization as vast and variable as the Aztecs, a little chaos was always part of the order. Back on your Chinampa, you kneel once more and begin to press more clay into the gaps between plantings. The maize roots appreciate the extra coolness. A lizard scurries past your foot, pauses to blink at you, then disappears into the bean vines. Above, a pair of birds argue from one of the willow branches, their calls sharp but oddly comforting. You've heard the same argument every afternoon this week. It's nice to know some things don't change. You tie back a trailing tomato vine with a bit of palm twine, then step back to admire your work. The garden is holding firm. The plants are upright, green, and healthy. The soil is dense. The water laps gently at the edges. And the ahuejotes stand tall, as they always do, casting shade where it's needed, drinking deeply from the very system they protect. There's a beauty in this that defies neat explanation. You're not just gardening, you're maintaining a floating organism, a biome balanced on roots, ritual, and daily stubbornness. You've learned how to layer reeds so they don't rot too fast. How to place clay where erosion threatens. How to listen for the sigh of a collapsing edge before it becomes a disaster. It's not heroic, but it's sacred in its own muddy way. As the sun begins to drop lower in the sky, you gather your tools and walk the narrow plank back to your canoe. You pause to look once more at your chinampa, your patient, floating patch of earth, and feel a quiet satisfaction settle into your chest. You built something here, you kept something here, and tomorrow, when the sun rises, you'll do it again. The next morning, you're ankle deep in water, one foot braced on a submerged root, the other trying not to lose balance as you peer along the edge of your chinampa. Something has shifted overnight, not dramatically, not enough to cause panic, but just enough to make you squint at the waterline with suspicion. The far end of the bed is lower than it should be. The soil there is slightly darker, heavier, slumping. You can see where the water has kissed its edge a little too eagerly. In the right conditions, say, after a night of hard rain or an unusually enthusiastic canal rat, that's how a garden begins to float away. You squish back up onto the bed, dripping, and feel that squelch beneath your feet. Chinampas may be stable, but they are not solid. That's part of the magic, and part of the risk. They live in a constant state of almost floating, almost sinking, almost land, almost raft. The system works because it walks a fine, squishy line between the two. And like all things balanced on edges, it requires maintenance, intuition, and a healthy respect for gravity. Here's your core historical fact for today. Chinampas were not truly floating gardens in the raft on a lake sense. They were fixed platforms, anchored in place by tree roots and weighted by carefully layered soil and organic matter. But they retained enough flexibility to rise and fall slightly with changes in water level. This semi-floating nature gave them resilience. During heavy floods, they could absorb excess water without being destroyed. During droughts, their proximity to the water table kept crops hydrated longer than dry land farming ever could. They weren't immune to nature, but they adapted to it. You kneel beside the sagging corner and press your palm into the soil. It's waterlogged, but salvageable. You call for your neighbor, a wiry old farmer named Weetsi who has seen more chinampas collapse than you've planted. He arrives in his canoe with a paddle, a woven reed mat, and an eyebrow already raised. "Didn't stake the new corner deep enough, huh?" he says, in the exact tone you expected. You nod. He crouches beside you, presses his own hands into the soft patch, and mutters something about last week's rain and the weight of your tomato vines. Then, without further judgment, he sets to work. Together, you drive in 2 more wooden stakes, wedge them deep beside the roots of the nearest ahuejote, then lash them with palm fiber cord. You lay the reed mat across the softest soil, pressing it flat to distribute the weight. You pile extra mud along the perimeter. The repair is ugly, lumpy, but effective. The bed holds. Here's a fringe historical tidbit. There are recorded stories of chinampas floating away during heavy rains or neglect, especially in the outer zones of Lake Xochimilco. Some were recovered, others drifted too far and had to be rebuilt from scratch. Local legends tell of lost gardens becoming islands, ghost patches of maize and beans slowly decaying in the middle of the lake, visited only by herons and mosquitoes. The reality is probably less poetic. Most were just too far gone to be worth saving, but the fear of a drifting chinampa was real enough to keep gardeners awake during stormy nights. You and Wheat C finish your patchwork and sit on a crate to watch the soil settle. The birds are louder now, morning in full swing. A heron stalks along the canal's edge. A dragonfly lands on your sleeve and pauses, unmoving. Somewhere across the water, a dog barks, muffled and distant. I saw one once, Wheat C says after a while, break in half. Sank straight down the middle. Beans floated off, looked like someone dumped lunch in the canal. You grimace. How long to fix? Never did, he says. Better to start again. You both sit with that thought for a minute. Because that's the quiet truth about this system. It works, beautifully, brilliantly, stubbornly, but only if you stay with it. Only if you listen to the land when it shifts under you. Only if you fix what sags before it sinks. And here's today's scholarly tension point. Historians still debate whether the semi-floating quality of chinampas was an intentional design or a fortunate accident. Some argue that the Aztecs engineered this subtle buoyancy on purpose, using layers of organic matter to create resilient, adaptive beds. Others think it was just a side effect, an emergent quality of building with waterlogged materials that happened to be beneficial. Either way, the result was a kind of living agriculture, a system that breathed with its environment instead of fighting it. You stand, brush mud from your knees, and thank Wheat C, who paddles off without another word. You walk the perimeter of your bed one more time, checking for more sag, more weakness. Everything else seems solid. The willows are holding. The soil has firmed under the sun's return. Your tomatoes, oblivious to the morning drama, sway gently in the breeze. You return to the center row and begin your weeding. The rhythm is comforting. Grip, twist, lift, toss. Your hands know what to do. The bed beneath you feels a little more trustworthy now, like an old friend who had a bad night but is back to form. You hum as you work, an old tune your grandfather used to whistle while tying squash vines. Around you, the chinampa network continues its quiet pulse. Paddles dipping, birds calling, water slapping gently against hand-packed mud walls. It's not dramatic, it's not flashy, but it is alive, it flexes, it endures. By mid-afternoon, the repaired edge has dried enough to walk on. You step along it carefully. It holds. You exhale, a little longer than necessary, and smile. Crisis, narrowly avoided. Your garden hasn't floated away today. And with a little luck, and a lot of watching, it won't float away tomorrow either. The sun is already slipping westward by the time you've finished securing the sagging edge of your chinampa, and now, at last, it's time for one of the more meditative, if mildly comical, chores in this watery world of agriculture: the daily transplant. You lower yourself into your canoe, narrow, slightly sticky with dried mud, the wood warm from a full day's sunlight, and reach for the woven tray of seedlings you've been preparing all week. Neatly nestled among folds of damp cloth are young chili plants, barely 3 fingers high, with bright green leaves already twitching with life. They're fragile, they're fussy, and like everything else on this lake, they require a paddle-powered journey just to be put in the ground. Or, well, the mud. You set off slowly, poling your canoe along the canal's edge, steering between beds, eyes scanning for open patches. On one side, squash vines sprawl lazily across the soil, curling around willow trunks like sleepy cats. On the other, you spot a space between rows of beans, the earth slightly darker, recently amended. You guide the canoe alongside and prepare to do what generations of Aztec gardeners did every single day. Carefully, quietly, move a plant from one tiny world to another. Here's your core historical fact. Unlike traditional farmers, who could walk across their fields or hitch up a plow animal, Chinampa farmers did nearly all of their planting and transport by canoe. The narrow canals between the beds weren't just for water. They were the only real roads through this floating world. Seeds, tools, compost, harvested crops, even family members moved by boat. It was like Venice, if Venice had been made out of mud, corn, and very determined trees. You steady the canoe with one foot on the bed and the other inside the hull, which is a position that no one would ever call graceful. Carefully, you lean forward, scoop a handful of mud from the tray beside you, dig a small hole with your fingers, and lower a chili seedling into place. You press it down gently, tuck it in like a child into bed, and reach for the next one. And here's your quirky little tidbit. Some Chinampa farmers believed that whispering to their transplants made them grow stronger. The belief wasn't entirely mystical. It was said that the breath of a human carried warmth and moisture, and that the act of speaking focused attention. Some whispered blessings, others used lullabies. One colonial observer wrote of a gardener who greeted each plant with the same phrase, "Don't float away this time." It was half joke, half prayer. You place another seedling, then another. The work is quiet, rhythmic, and oddly intimate. Each plant is a conversation, a small act of trust. You don't force them into the soil, you ask. You shape the mud around their roots like a promise. The canal laps gently against the side of your canoe. A frog croaks from somewhere under the squash. A breeze rustles the maize leaves overhead, sending little waves of shade dancing across your arm. Time drips past you in slow, even drops. Now for the scholarly squabble of the hour. Historians still argue whether the sheer productivity of Chinampas was due to superior technique or just relentless effort. Some point to the rich lakebed soil, the self-watering design, the ideal climate. Others insist it was the endless labor, the daily weeding, the constant transplanting, the never-ending ferrying of seedlings, that made the system hum. The truth, as usual, is probably a muddied blend of both. You finish planting your last seedling and wipe your hands on your thigh, leaving streaks of dark silt across your robe. You sit back in the canoe, letting it drift gently for a moment, the breeze tugging at your hair, the sun dipping low behind a distant row of willows. You close your eyes, just for a moment, just to listen. You hear the wings of a bird cutting the air, the drip of water from a paddle, the quiet murmur of someone singing 2 beds over. The lake doesn't sleep, exactly, it just quiets. It lets things settle. Like sediment, like thought. You open your eyes and look down at the seedlings now resting in their new home. They're upright, leaves spread, already more certain than when they left the tray. You smile, you've done your part, the water will do the rest. You paddle back slowly, taking the long way, gliding between chinampas lined with maize, beans, and marigolds. You pass a woman in another canoe, collecting flowers. She nods to you. No words exchanged. Just the silent agreement of two people in the same floating maze, doing their part. Back at your plot, you step onto the soil and tie your canoe to the willow post again. The sky has turned apricot and silver. In the fading light, the chinampas look less like gardens and more like dreams. Long, narrow strips of green suspended in a mirror. You gather your tools. You brush the mud from your knees. You pause to run your hand over the nearest tomato plant, its fruit nearly ripe. And you wonder, not for the first time, how many boat rides it took to build this world. How many paddles dipped into the water. How many arms carried seedlings like tiny hopes from shore to plot, from tray to soil, from dream to dinner. And as you head back for the night, you know the answer doesn't really matter. What matters is that it worked. And tomorrow, you'll paddle out again. By now, the sun is low enough that it stretches everything long. Your shadow slips over the canal like a ribbon. The willows lean across the water in gold-tipped silhouette. And even the bean vines seem to elongate with the last warmth of the day. You're crouched over a patch of peppers, eyes scanning for signs of ripeness, when it hits you. This bed, this floating tangle of soil and roots, is doing something that shouldn't really be possible. It's producing food in a swamp. And not just some food, a lot. Fat peppers, glossy tomatoes, marigolds blooming between maize stalks. It's absurd and brilliant and more than a little poetic. You reach down and cup one of the chili plants, lifting a small, curved pepper into the light. It's still green, but nearly ready. You admire its sheen, then gently lower it back into the leaves. As you rise, your knees cracking with the effort, you glance across the chinampa and smile at the strangeness of it all. These aren't neatly plowed rows. There are no fences, and yet, things grow. Things flourish. With a little mud and some daily devotion, you've made floating food real. Here's your core historical fact for tonight's slow descent into botanical awe. Chinampas supported an astonishing range of crops. The Aztecs didn't just grow corn and beans, though they grew those in abundance. They cultivated amaranth, squash, chilies, tomatoes, herbs like epazote and chives, edible flowers like marigold and nasturtium, and even medicinal plants tucked between rows. In some beds, flowers were grown exclusively for market sale or ritual use, their petals plucked before sunrise and ferried by canoe to the center of Tenochtitlan. And yes, some plots were reserved just for peppers. You walk the row slowly now, hands behind your back like a sleepy inspector. The pepper plants are spaced precisely. The soil is slightly damp, good. Not waterlogged, better. You spot the occasional weed and pluck it with practiced ease. These plants are your quiet, spicy children. High maintenance. A little dramatic in full sun, but deeply rewarding. Now here's the quirky little detail that doesn't always make the textbooks. Aztec farmers occasionally placed small charms or carved stones in their chili beds to ward off pests and encourage growth. These weren't grand religious offerings, just humble talismans. A polished bit of obsidian, a carved animal shape, a shell fragment worn smooth by water. One 16th century chronicler recorded seeing a frog made of stone tucked beneath a pepper vine, for fortune and fertility. Whether it worked is up for debate, but when your vegetables are floating on a swamp, you don't take chances. You kneel again and gently turn over a leaf. No bite marks, no beetles. You nod to yourself and move on. Farther down the row, you pass into a different section. Amaranth. Their tall, brushy heads wave in the breeze, soft plumes of crimson and gold. Amaranth isn't just a grain here, it's a cultural anchor. The Aztecs loved it, used it in rituals, baked it into cakes, and sometimes shaped those cakes into small figures for ceremonial consumption. It's light, nutritious, and it grows like it enjoys being stared at. You trail your fingers through a row of its swaying heads, and the tiny seeds fall like whispers into your palm. As the evening deepens, the frogs begin their song. Loud, repetitive, almost accusatory. You ignore them and move on to the final bed. Squash. These plants sprawl like gossip, low to the soil, their huge leaves overlapping like parasols in a crowd. Beneath them, the squash swell, green, striped, heavy. You lift one slightly and grunt. Not ready yet, but soon. The vines have wrapped around the stake you placed last week and are now attempting to escape into the canal. And here's the historical debate of the hour. Historians still argue whether crop placement on chinampas followed a precise rotational logic or was more intuitive. Some evidence suggests that farmers followed strict cycles, planting legumes after grains to replenish nitrogen, spacing flowering herbs to attract helpful insects, and using canal-facing rows for thirstier crops. Others believe it was more fluid, based on observation, tradition, and neighborly advice rather than rigid calendars. As usual, the truth likely lived somewhere in the middle, buried in soil that remembers more than it reveals. You gather a few mature herbs into a bundle, epazote, hoja santa, a bit of chive. Tied together, they smell like dinner and medicine and festival all at once. You sit on a nearby stone, watching the sun bleed into the water, and listen to the gentle rustle of your plants turning in for the night. And that's when it happens. A heron drops into the canal with all the grace of a god slipping into a dream. It lands, flaps once, and stands still, its long neck curving like a question mark. It stares at your peppers. You stare at it. Don't even think about it, you mutter. The heron blinks slowly, then stalks away with exaggerated dignity. You rise and carry your herbs to the canoe. The boat rocks gently as you step in, the plants nestled in your lap, the water golden now, thick with reflected sky. You paddle slowly between the beds, passing chinampas thick with maize and squash blossoms, hearing the murmur of other farmers closing out their day. It's not dramatic, this closing hour. Just tender. Just enough. You reach the shore, step out, and untie your robe with one hand, your herb bundle tucked under the other. Your skin smells of sunlight and soil. Your arms are tired in that good way. The peppers will be ready next week. The tomatoes soon after. The garden is doing its work, and you are, somehow, part of it. As you walk home through the soft dusk, the floating gardens stretch behind you like a secret kingdom, half water, half earth, all miracle. The air is thicker this morning, and the clouds are hanging low like a damp quilt draped across the lake. You slip into your canoe with the familiarity of muscle memory, pushing off from the muddy bank and guiding yourself back into the channels with practiced strokes. The surface of the water is scattered with petals from yesterday's wind, yellow marigold, crushed white squash blossom, a smear of red from something unidentified but probably harmless. It's quiet, not silent, never silent, but soft. The world hums under its breath. You arrive at your chinampa and dock beside the ahuejote whose roots drink greedily from the canal. Everything here feels still damp from the night. The leaves, the soil, the air. You begin your inspection. You're not looking for weeds today. Or ripeness. Today is about the water. How it moves, where it pools, what it tells you about the health of your floating world. Because unlike farms that rely on clouds and prayers, this one is irrigated by design, sustained not by chance, but by canals that breathe with intention. Here's your core historical fact. Chinampas used a passive irrigation system based entirely on their surrounding canals. The soil retained moisture from the constant contact with the water that bordered it on all sides, eliminating the need for artificial watering. Roots reached outward and downward into that ever-present reservoir, drawing in what they needed. But it wasn't just nature doing the work. Aztec farmers manipulated water flow with precision, clearing silt from canals, deepening troughs, redirecting currents with small hand-dug channels between plots. The entire system was like a wet lung, expanding, contracting, always alive. You crouch and press your fingers into the soil at the base of your amaranth stalks. Damp, but not soggy. That's good. Too dry, the plants wilt. Too wet, the roots rot. The key to Chinampa irrigation isn't flooding, it's proximity. You walk a narrow row and note how the water level in the canal has dropped slightly since yesterday. That means you'll need to dredge soon. And that brings you to one of the least glamorous, most vital jobs on the lake: silt scooping. With wide, flat baskets or long-handled dredging tools, you and your fellow farmers will spend hours hauling rich black muck from the canal bottom and layering it back onto the beds. It feeds the soil, maintains the bed height, keeps the water flowing. It smells earthy, and a little like something you'd politely avoid stepping in. Here's your quirky tidbit. The Aztecs not only used canal silt as fertilizer, but they also considered it spiritually potent. Some believed it contained the essence of Tlaloc, the rain god, and treated the first scoop of the season with reverence. A few would even drop a piece of incense into the canal before beginning, asking the water to be generous. Was it symbolic? Absolutely. Did it smell nice? Absolutely not. You grab your small rake and begin clearing debris from the edge of one canal. Duckweed, a few broken leaves, a mysterious feather. The water ripples at your touch, and you watch the current drift slightly westward. That tells you what you need to know. The lake is shifting, ever so subtly, which means it's time to adjust the small inlet that runs between your beds. You wade in knee-deep, slide your hands through the reeds, and clear a space for the water to pass through more freely. You feel it move, slow and cool, against your legs. The beauty of this system is how little it asks from you. No pumps, no wells, no prayers for rain. But that doesn't mean it's passive. The water requires your attention. If a canal clogs, a whole row could wilt. If silt builds too high, water stagnates. You are not fighting the lake. You are listening to it. You're its gardener and its guest. Now let's dive into the debate. Historians still discuss whether the irrigation efficiency of Chinampas was truly superior to terraced or dry farming in other regions. On paper, it seems unbeatable: year-round growing seasons, high yields, minimal water loss. But some researchers argue that the labor required to maintain canal networks, especially during heavy flood seasons or extended droughts, may have balanced out the advantages. Still, the fact that Chinampa systems fed an empire speaks volumes. Even the Spaniards, skeptical of everything else, couldn't deny the abundance they found here. You return to the surface of the plot and walk the perimeter, now alert to any signs of water damage. One spot near the beans is too dry, likely because the canal is slightly lower on that side. You make a mental note to redirect some flow later with a small ditch. Another area looks suspiciously moist. You press your fingers into the earth. It's soft, borderline marshy. You'll stop irrigation to that area for a day and let the sun do its work. It's not high-tech, but it's smart. You sit back now, rake across your lap, and glance down the long, narrow bed. The water on either side reflects a sky so wide it feels like a roof you can reach up and knock on. You sip from a gourd of tamarind water and watch a dragonfly chase its own reflection. It's in moments like this that you feel the strangeness of where you are, not on land, not on water, but in between. Balanced, alive, and the best part? You never had to carry a bucket. You paddle back toward the edge of your territory as the clouds begin to shift, revealing patches of soft blue. Sunlight returns in threads, weaving gold through the willow leaves, lighting up the droplets that cling to your sleeves. You pause beside another farmer's bed, wave silently, and point to his north canal. He nods. He saw it too. The water's not moving right there. He'll fix it. You'll help later, if needed. The network is communal. The water doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to all of you. You tie your canoe and step out onto your own chinampa once more, just to feel it. The ground gives a little under your weight, as always, but then holds. You take a breath. The roots are drinking. The canals are flowing. The plants are growing. And the water, silent, steady, keeps everything alive. You didn't pray for rain today. You didn't need to. It's barely light when you reach the water again. The stars have only just begun to fade, and the air still carries that pre-dawn hush that makes you feel like you're the only soul awake in the entire valley. But you're not. As you paddle past the sleeping willows and glide between the chinampas, you hear it, faint, rhythmic, unmistakable. The dull thunk of a wooden hoe, the splash of a paddle cutting the surface, the low murmur of voices already at work. The farmers are up, and so are the warriors. You pull up to your garden and tie off the canoe, shoulders still tight from yesterday's planting, your palms raw from the rake. Today, you'll prune the maize, maybe haul more silt, mend the canal bank near the beans. But by dusk, you'll be sharpening obsidian. Because you're not just a gardener. You're a soldier too. Here's the honest, slightly wild truth. Many Aztec chinampa farmers were also trained warriors. These weren't separate professions in neatly divided boxes. You could spend your morning weeding amaranth and your evening hauling a spear. It wasn't a contradiction. It was a necessity. Feeding the empire was noble work. So was defending it, and the two often went hand in hand. Your maize rows are tall now, shoulder high, rustling with each breeze, and you duck between them with the agility of someone who's done this 1,000 times. The soil is firm, well-watered, dense with life. You stop to adjust a stalk that's leaning too far, then continue your inspection, all the while thinking about the training exercises planned for tonight. A march, some spear forms, possibly a group drill if the moon is full enough. You smile to yourself. The transition from mud to warfare is not as dramatic as it sounds. Both require patience, timing, endurance, and honestly, both involve a fair amount of yelling. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Aztec economy and military were deeply intertwined, with many citizens alternating between farming and military duty depending on season, age, and social rank. Land-owning farmers in particular had responsibilities beyond their crops, including militia participation, religious festivals, and community defense. The Chinampa zones around Tenochtitlan were especially vital. as they produced a huge percentage of the empire's food. And as a result, these farmers were often called upon to defend what they grew. You pause now, crouching low to examine a tomato plant that's developing a worrying yellow tinge. Maybe too much shade? You tuck a leaf under a cane to lift it, then make a note to check the water flow again later. You are, at this moment, entirely absorbed in the well-being of a tomato. And yet, if the temple drums sound tonight, you'll be running, not with a spade, but a spear. This dual identity shaped a lot about how chinampas were managed. The beds were designed to be as efficient as possible, not just to maximize food, but to minimize time. If you could get 5 harvests a year instead of 3, that meant more surplus. More tribute, more warriors freed from farming duties during campaign seasons. More ability to focus on empire building rather than fieldwork. In a strange way, the productivity of these humble floating gardens made conquest possible. And here's a delightful fringe detail. Some Chinampa farmers trained in full gear, obsidian blades, cotton armor, ceremonial plumes. While standing in the same beds they weeded. The idea was not just to save time, but to learn balance. If you could keep your footing on soft soil while sparring with a wooden blade, you were more likely to hold your ground on a battlefield. Plus, you could sneak in a little weeding between drills. Efficiency at its finest. You rise again and stretch, the sun warming your shoulders, the sound of another canoe slipping past behind you. A boy rows this one, maybe 12, maybe younger, heading out with baskets of fresh greens for the morning market. His canoe is so full it nearly sinks with every stroke. You watch him pass, a flicker of future farmer, future warrior, future something. Here on the lake, everything grows. Even people. You walk the edge of your bed, tapping the poles that hold the border in place. The ahuejotes are doing their job, their roots tangled deep into the water below. The canals are low again, you'll need to dredge soon. Maybe after tonight's drills, if your arms still work. And that brings us to today's scholarly debate. Historians still discuss whether the Chinampa system was sustainable only because of its combination with military labor. Was it really the magic of soil and water that made it thrive, or the fact that so many of the gardeners were also empire builders, able to expand, defend, and redistribute labor with precision? Some argue the system would have collapsed without the structure of military service behind it. Others believe it would have survived as a purely civilian network. The answer, as always, likely lies somewhere in the murky canal between those two ideas. You reach your canoe again, herbs in hand, and sit for a moment in its hollow. The water laps gently at the hull. The sun glitters. Your breath slows. You smell basil and mud, and the faintest hint of lakefish on the wind. This is your garden. This is your battlefield. And this, somehow, is home. Later, you'll tie your hair back, sharpen your obsidian, and march to the beat of a drum carved long before your grandfather's time. But right now, you touch the stem of a maize plant and feel the pulse of something older. Not war, not pride, just growth, just quiet, just another day in a life that floats, feeds, and fights, sometimes all at once. The first thing you hear as you round the bend in the canal is not the soft rustle of maize leaves or the whisper of water against the Chinampa, it's a splash. Not dramatic, just enough to get your attention. You glance down and see the ripples radiating outward, slow and deliberate. Then another splash, followed by a high-pitched trill. You ease your canoe forward, paddle quiet, eyes scanning the surface. And there they are, fish. Dozens of them, small, silvery, darting just beneath the surface between two beds of tomato and squash. They scatter at your approach, then regroup a few feet away, weaving like threads through the submerged roots. You rest your paddle and drift, watching. And suddenly, you remember, the Chinampas weren't just farms. They were fisheries too. Here's your core historical fact. The canals between the Chinampas weren't simply convenient routes for canoes. They were living systems, stocked with edible fish, amphibians, and other aquatic resources. Farmers who managed Chinampas also harvested fish like acasil, a type of crayfish, small whitefish, and various species of carp, along with frogs, tadpoles, and even insects like water boatmen, which were scooped up, dried, and eaten as a high-protein snack. The gardens didn't just feed Tenochtitlan with maize and squash. They fed it with everything that wriggled and swam as well. You let your fingers trail through the water. It's warm at the surface but cool just beneath. A frog floats nearby, fat and drowsy, unbothered by your presence. In the reeds at the edge of the bed, a turtle basks on a half-submerged log, its neck stretched skyward, legs out like a sun-drunk lizard. You smile. It's a strange garden, this place, half crop, half aquarium. But it works. And here's a curious detail, one that makes you sit up and raise your eyebrows. Some Chinampa owners intentionally managed their canals as fish farms, introducing aquatic plants to feed the fish and constructing small enclosures, basically reed fences, to keep their fish from wandering too far. It wasn't full-scale aquaculture by modern standards, but it was something remarkably close. A natural, symbiotic system. You feed the fish fertilize the water feeds the plants. And you get dinner, twice. You decide to test your luck. Reaching beneath your seat, you pull out the simple net you keep rolled tight with your tools. It's more habit than hope. Most days the fish are too quick, but you cast it gently into the canal, letting it sink just beside the roots of a tomato plant leaning over the edge. You hold the cord loosely, wait, and listen. And while you do, let's linger in the debate pool. Historians still argue whether this fish-plant dual system was formally organized or just an opportunistic byproduct of living on the water. Some scholars argue the fish were managed deliberately, with designated zones and seasonal harvesting routines. Others suggest the fish were more of a bonus, plentiful, sure, but incidental. What we know for certain is that the Aztecs made use of what was there. They didn't waste. If something moved, it could be a meal. And if it swam, it was already halfway to your bowl. You tug the net gently after a few minutes. One fish. Not big, not particularly bright, but undeniably caught. You laugh softly, shake your head, and return it to the water. A frog chirps in what you choose to interpret as polite applause. You coil the net again and tuck it away. The harvest today will be herbs and squash, not fish. And that's fine. The canal will still be here tomorrow. You stand in your canoe now, balancing with the care of someone who's done this 1,000 times. You use your paddle to push away from the Chinampa's edge and drift down a narrow, winding channel shaded by willows and flanked by amaranth. Overhead, birds call from the trees, kingfishers, maybe, or herons. One flaps suddenly into view, its long legs trailing, its reflection splitting the surface in two. You float beneath a fallen branch and pass a bed of floating flowers, marigold and morning glory, planted for the market but now blooming mostly for the bees. You dip your hand again into the water and feel a sudden burst of motion beneath. Fish. always fish, always moving. And here's your whimsical fringe tidbit. Water boatmen, those tiny, paddle-legged insects that skim across the surface, were harvested by the Aztecs, dried, ground, and sometimes baked into little cakes. They were crunchy, nutty, packed with protein, and probably not your first choice at a feast, but as snacks go, surprisingly sustainable. Some Chinampa farmers would stir the water with branches to encourage the boatmen to the surface, then scoop them with fine baskets. You can't help but admire that level of commitment. You return to your own bed now, tie the canoe, and step lightly back onto the spongy soil. The tomatoes are climbing higher, their green fruit swelling in the sun. The canal beside them glitters with movement. Even the water, it seems, wants to grow something. You kneel again to weed around the peppers, hands in the soil, the sound of frogs and water lapping just beyond your shoulder. You don't need a field. You don't need a tractor. You just need mud, patience, and the quiet company of creatures that don't mind sharing a garden. And as the day moves forward, slow and soft, you realize this is more than a place to grow food. It's a place to live with food, with water, with life that swims beside you as much as it sprouts beneath you. It's not a farm, it's a floating community, and it's always in motion. The light over the Chinampa has taken on that hazy, bleached quality that only appears at midday, when the sun seems to press directly down into the soil, into your skin, into your very bones. There's no breeze, only heat. You wipe the sweat from your brow with a sleeve already streaked with mud and take a long, lukewarm gulp from your gourd. It's not exactly refreshing, but it'll keep you upright. And you're going to need to be upright, because there's a lot left to do today. There's always a lot, but don't worry, you've got the rhythm down by now. Welcome to a full day in the life of a Chinampa farmer. Don't forget to stretch your knees. They're going to be doing most of the work. You started before the sun, as usual, when the lake was still misted over and the frogs were louder than the birds. First came the inspection, walking the perimeter, checking for signs of erosion or unwanted visitors. Then came the dredging. You used your flat-bottomed scoop to pull silt from the canal, one basket at a time, layering it back onto the beds where the squash roots had begun to show. It's not glamorous, but the soil doesn't fertilize itself. You try to think of it as feeding the land, not hauling muck. And here's your core historical fact. Chinampa farmers operated on a tightly coordinated daily cycle designed to maximize efficiency and productivity. Tasks were rotated based on weather, crop phase, moon cycle, and even spiritual observances. While some focused on sowing or harvesting, others maintained the beds, tended the canal walls, managed aquatic life, or delivered produce to the market in Tenochtitlan. Farming wasn't just a job, it was a public service, a sacred act, and a physical routine that shaped the body as much as the mind. Mid-morning, after you've dealt with the squash and packed the dredged silt into low ridges near the tomato rows, you shift to weeding. It's the quietest part of the day, just you and your hands and the rustle of green. You sit low on your haunches, fingers curled like claws, eyes half-lidded in the glare. Pull, shake, toss. Pull, shake, toss. Your palms are nicked and stained. You smell like lake water and crushed leaves. You've been told that you do your best thinking while weeding, though that may just be a polite way of saying you don't talk much. Now here's your offbeat tidbit. Some Chinampa farmers marked time with their shadow. Before sundials were widespread or when you forgot to bring one, as you often do, you simply stood upright and measured the length and tilt of your shadow on the garden bed. One farmer's diary noted that, "When my shadow lies between the beans and the squash, it is time for tamales." Surprisingly accurate. And speaking of tamales, it's midday now, which means food. You retreat to a shaded corner beneath the largest willow, unwrap your meal from its maguey fiber cloth, and enjoy a humble spread. A tamale stuffed with beans and chili, a handful of roasted amaranth seeds, and a square of salted avocado. It's nothing fancy, but it tastes like home. You eat slowly, methodically, listening to the buzz of bees in the marigolds and the distant thump of someone unloading baskets onto a dock across the canal. That's another task on your list today, delivery. Once you've eaten and cleaned up, you load up your canoe with what's ready for market. A bundle of herbs, some ripe tomatoes, a sack of maize flour milled yesterday. The boat dips low under the weight, but it's still manageable. You paddle steadily toward the central drop-off point, where city porters will collect your bundles and ferry them to the markets in Tenochtitlan. If you're lucky, you'll get your empty baskets back by dusk. And here's the historical debate of the day. Historians still argue whether Chinampa output was distributed individually or communally. Some claim that families owned specific plots and traded produce through formal market channels. Others believe the system functioned more collectively, with state-appointed officials organizing deliveries and managing labor rotation. What's most likely is a blend, a communal backbone with private initiative layered on top. Either way, your tomatoes are someone else's lunch by the time the sun begins to tilt westward. Back at the bed, you return to repair work. A loose willow stake gets reset. A corner of the canal bank is slumping and needs a mud patch. You trim the upper branches on the maize to keep them from shading out the amaranth. You talk to yourself a little, though you deny it if asked. Everyone does it, blame the isolation, or the frogs. You hum an old song that your grandfather used to sing, mostly off-key, but the plants don't seem to mind. By late afternoon, your back is sore. Your arms are trembling slightly from the morning's work. But there's still more to do. One last sweep for pests, another inspection of the canal levels, and a quick pass to see if the beans need trellising. You move slowly now, methodically. Not out of laziness, just precision. Chinampa work rewards consistency. It rewards noticing things that don't shout for attention. The faint yellowing of a leaf, the scent of rot in one corner, the sudden quiet of a usually noisy patch of frogs. You finish your last round as the sun touches the hills in the distance. Everything is golden. The water gleams like polished jade. The maize leaves sway like dancers bowing at the end of a performance. And you're exhausted, covered in dirt, slightly sunburned, and deeply satisfied. Here's the final thought as the sky deepens to violet. Chinampa farming wasn't just productive, it was sustainable, efficient, and deeply tied to the rhythms of both nature and human effort. It required daily attention, constant repair, and a willingness to live in partnership with water. But in return, it fed an empire. You lie back on a patch of dry soil, just for a moment, and watch the clouds turn pink above the trees. The frogs resume their evening chorus. A canoe glides past, carrying a woman and her child home, their laughter echoing softly across the canal. It's not a glamorous life, but it's a good one. And when the stars come out, you'll sleep well, body aching, hands stained, belly full. Tomorrow, you'll rise before the mist lifts, and do it all again. You wake before the sun again, groggy but practiced, slipping from your woven sleeping mat and straight into the gentle routine of another Chinampa day. There's no door to open, just the soft flap of a reed curtain and the open sky yawning over the lake. You step barefoot across packed mud and into your canoe, as always, and paddle through the silver dark water toward your floating fields. But today, there's something different in the air. A kind of quiet buzz. The city's calling. You can feel it even from here. Tenochtitlan, with its markets and temples, its smell of hot stone and grinding maize, is waking up hungry. And you're part of the system that feeds it. Here's your central historical truth for today's voyage. Tenochtitlan, the massive Aztec capital, relied heavily on Chinampa agriculture for its food supply. The city floated like a stone flower in the middle of Lake Texcoco, crisscrossed with canals, connected by causeways, pulsing with trade and ritual and noise, and it needed vast quantities of food, arriving daily, to survive. The Chinampas surrounding the city, especially in regions like Xochimilco and Mixquiche, formed the empire's breadbasket. Or more accurately, its cornucopia. Its floating cornucopia. You paddle harder now, your boat loaded with today's harvest. Tomatoes in wide reed baskets. A bundle of green amaranth leaves, still beaded with dew. A clay pot of beans, cooked last night for trade. The canoe rides low, its weight causing the water to slosh against your knees. But that's fine. The sun's rising, and you want to get to the market by its peak, before the best spots are taken. As you pass other Chinampas, you see others doing the same. A man rows past with nothing but squash blossoms, delicate and gold. A woman steers with one hand and nurses a baby with the other, her boat stacked with baskets of chilies. Children crouch on the banks of their families' plots, tossing food scraps to ducks and scooping water with chipped bowls. Everyone is moving. The system flows. Here's your strange but true detail. Estimates suggest Chinampas may have produced more food per acre than many modern intensive farming methods, largely because of the year-round productivity enabled by the warm climate and constant irrigation. Aztec farmers planted in staggered rotations, meaning there was always something ripening, something being pulled, something about to go in. Crops didn't rest, neither did the farmers. You reach the central canal that feeds into the city and merge with a loose, floating convoy. Canoes bob nose to tail like sleepy ducks. You smell tamales cooking somewhere, and someone's playing a reed flute, shrill and plaintive, but oddly soothing. In the distance, Tenochtitlan rises like a mirage. White buildings catching the new light, temple steps glowing orange, plumes of incense rising into the blue. It's massive, teeming, unbelievably alive. As you approach the main docks, you see the causeways already bustling. Porters unload crates. Market guards shout instructions. Priests in cotton robes walk barefoot, their heads bowed. Your canoe bumps gently against the wooden dock, and you tie off quickly, hoisting your baskets one at a time onto the wide planks. The market lies just ahead. Now for the debate of the morning. Historians still discuss the exact scale of Chinampa contributions to the city's food supply. Some claim the Chinampas produced enough to feed a majority of Tenochtitlan's population, possibly as many as 200,000 people, while others believe they supplemented more than they sustained. What's not disputed is their efficiency or their consistency. The Chinampas kept food flowing. Without them, the city would have starved. You carry your produce through the marketplace now, weaving between stalls of obsidian tools, cotton tunics, cacao beans, and carved bone jewelry. The air is hot and fragrant with roasting peppers and fresh tortilla. You pass a group selling salt cakes, another selling frog legs on skewers. A boy tugs your sleeve and offers to trade you a clay flute for one of your squashes. You laugh and wave him off gently. You reach your vendor space, a worn reed mat in the shade of a temple wall, and begin to display your goods. Others arrive around you, unrolling mats, lighting incense, bartering already. You don't shout, you don't need to. The regulars know your face. They know your tomatoes. Within minutes, your first basket is half empty. And here's your final peculiar tidbit of the day. The Aztecs used small green stones called chalchihuil as tokens of exchange in some market circles, especially when trading produce. They weren't currency in the strict sense, but they held symbolic and spiritual value, especially in trades involving food. Giving one with a handful of chilies was a gesture of goodwill, or sometimes apology, depending on the ripeness. You sell steadily through the morning. Not everything goes. Some of the herbs wilt before you can make a deal, and one woman insists your beans are too soft. But the tomatoes sell out. The amaranth goes quickly. You keep a few peppers for dinner and one small gourd of pickled nopales, wrapped tight to stay cool. As the sun crests and begins its descent, the market begins to thin. You pack your empty baskets, tie them into your canoe, and begin the slow paddle home. Your muscles ache, your eyes sting with sweat, but the lake welcomes you back with its glassy surface and soft bird calls. You glide between the beds, past maize and marigold, past canoes still unloading. And when you reach your plot, it's exactly as you left it, green, damp, alive. You step onto the soil, pat the nearest willow trunk, and crouch beside your squash. You're home again. You've helped feed a city. And the garden thanks you by not floating away. By mid-morning, the sun has mellowed slightly, and the lake's mood has shifted from industrious to almost meditative. After your early delivery to the Tenochtitlan market, you've returned to your chinampa with just enough energy left to do a little comparing. Because while your floating fields may be humble, patches of squash, a few struggling tomatoes, a perfectly average crop of amaranth, there are other gardens, and then there are those gardens. The royal ones, the elite ones, the ones that don't grow for survival but for show. You paddle lazily toward the edge of the chinampa zone, away from the bustle of market-bound canoes, past quiet garden beds whose keepers are off at midday rest. Your destination is one of the dry land gardens built on the city's higher terraces, something more ornamental, more sculpted, more symbolic. And if you're being honest, a little more pampered than your own soggy empire of mud. You dock near a stepped platform, where carved stones mark the boundary of one of these royal plots. It doesn't float, it doesn't need to. This garden is built on solid ground, fed by aqueducts and watched over by statues of gods with complicated facial expressions. The rows are tight, manicured, filled with flowers you'd never waste chinampa space on. Turquoise-colored blossoms, delicate orchids, cacao trees grown in pots under woven canopies. This is not a place for beans and squash. This is a garden of prestige. Here's your core historical truth. Alongside the chinampas, the Aztecs also maintained elite ornamental gardens for nobles, priests, and emperors, typically constructed on solid ground, using imported plants, and irrigated with aqueduct systems. These gardens served as symbols of wealth and power, as well as centers for medicinal herb cultivation and religious ceremony. They were carefully curated, less about sustenance and more about aesthetics, status, and ritual display. You walk slowly through the outer edge, not trespassing exactly, just observing. A young servant nods at you from a shaded corner, too polite to ask why your tunic is covered in canal mud. You smile, touch your forehead, and continue. These dry land plots are quiet, precise, and deeply fragrant. You see a priest bending over a pot of white flowers, whispering something as he plucks a few petals and tucks them into a woven pouch. You know better than to interrupt. And here's a charming fringe detail. Some noble gardens were said to include listening plants, shrubs and flowers believed to carry the sound of prayers to the gods. Were they chosen for the way their leaves rustled in the wind? Or just for their association with sacred myths? No one knows for sure. But one emperor, Nezahualcóyotl, reportedly planted a grove of these whispering plants beside his personal bathhouse and would pace among them while composing poetry. You pluck a fallen blossom from one of these shrubs and tuck it behind your ear, just in case it's listening now. The contrast between these gardens and your chinampa is hard to ignore. Here, nothing floats. The soil is dry, the edges are crisp, the wind carries the scent of sandalwood and citrus. It's beautiful, undeniably, but you can't help thinking how quickly these plots would struggle without their fountains and servants. A drought would starve them. A heavy rain would flatten them. Your floating bed of maize and squash, meanwhile, would keep quietly growing. Not glorious, but dependable. And that leads us into today's scholarly debate. Historians continue to examine how the dual presence of chinampas and royal gardens shaped Aztec agricultural hierarchy. Were ornamental gardens seen as superior, or simply different? Did chinampa laborers view them with envy, or were they proud of their more productive role? Some evidence suggests overlap, a kind of reverence for both function and form. Others argue that dry land gardens were largely inaccessible, shrouded in ceremony and reserved for elite hands. You return to your canoe as the wind picks up slightly, catching the edges of your tunic and sending small ripples across the canal. You push off, drifting back toward your chinampa, and as the royal terraces fade behind you, you feel the shift. The air grows heavier with lake scent, the water deepens to its usual green, and the familiar murmur of frogs returns like background music. You step back onto your own plot with a soft thud and pause to take it in. The squash is sprawling again. The maize is steady. The canal hasn't risen too much since morning. And the heron who claims the north end is, as always, ignoring you. You walk the length of your bed, eyes sweeping across the rows, not looking for anything in particular, just checking in. There are no statues here. No ornamental borders. But there's food. There's life. There's rhythm. The willow trees hum in the breeze. The water moves steadily along the canal edge, and your tomato vines, stubborn as ever, have produced 2 more ripe fruits while you were gone. You sit down cross-legged near the edge, feet just brushing the canal, and let yourself sink into the weight of the afternoon. The royal gardens are beautiful, but they don't smell like this. They don't buzz like this. They don't float, and floating, you've decided, is its own kind of poetry. The afternoon haze has settled in with that warm, buzzing stillness that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. Even the wind has gone quiet. You kneel beside your amaranth patch, digging your fingers carefully beneath a cluster of weeds, and notice a small beetle inching along one of the stems. It's shiny, black, and, unfortunately, not one of the helpful ones. You sigh, pluck it gently between 2 fingers, and flick it into the canal, where a frog snaps it up with enthusiastic gratitude. That's teamwork, you think, and return to your weeding. Not all bugs are enemies here. In fact, In the watery world of Chinampa farming, not all weeds are bad, and not all insects are villains. The line between helpful and harmful blurs. This isn't a clean system, not by modern sterile standards. It's alive and messy, and filled with visitors both welcome and not. Here's your mainstream historical insight. Aztec Chinampa farmers used natural pest management strategies long before the invention of modern pesticides. They relied on a combination of companion planting, soil health, water flow, and good old-fashioned manual labor to keep infestations under control. Certain flowers, like marigolds, were planted alongside crops to deter harmful insects. Frogs and birds helped too, eating larvae and beetles before they could chew their way through a season's worth of chilies. You pause your weeding to examine a cluster of marigolds you planted between rows last month. Their scent is sharp, lemony, and earthy, supposedly unappealing to some pests. You like them for another reason: they make the rows look cheerful. Bright orange pinwheels in a sea of green. And here's your quirky little tidbit. Aztec farmers sometimes consulted omens, especially birds and insects, before planting or pruning. If a certain kind of butterfly landed on your bean row, it was good luck. If ants appeared too early in the season, it was a warning to delay. There's even a record of one gardener who claimed to speak with a raven that advised him on squash spacing. Did the raven actually know anything about squash? Probably not, but the yield was excellent that year. You reach for your basket of twine and begin tying up a few unruly tomato vines. Nearby, a bee buzzes lazily around a squash blossom, vanishing into its golden throat before emerging dusted with pollen. It loops past your ear and zips away. You smile. No need for science journals here. You can see the pollination happening in real time. This might be a good moment to explain something to your modern, sleepy brain. Weeds were not always removed. Some were allowed to stay, especially along canal banks or in corners where their roots helped bind the soil. Certain weeds were even harvested for medicine or food. One broad-leafed plant near your willow tree, for instance, is known to soothe stomach cramps when steeped in hot water. Your grandmother swore by it. So did her grandmother before her. You straighten up for a moment, pressing your hands into the small of your back and glancing out over the water. The Chinampas stretch on, some tidy and neat, others wild and overgrown. A few are abandoned, the willows overreaching, their canals choked with algae. But most are alive, somewhere between cultivated and feral. That's the beauty of the system. It doesn't demand perfection. It thrives in collaboration. Now for the scholarly debate of the hour. Historians still argue whether Chinampa pest management was a product of deliberate agricultural science or intuitive, accumulated folk knowledge. Some scholars point to clear patterns of companion planting, canal dredging schedules, and seasonal crop rotations as evidence of advanced ecological understanding. Others believe these practices evolved more casually, learned through observation and oral tradition rather than formal experimentation. Either way, the system worked. Pests were managed, crops thrived, frogs got fat. You crouch again and continue your inspection. A vine is turning yellow at the edge of one bed. You pinch the stem, smell the base, decide it's just old age and not disease. You leave it. You spot a patch of mushrooms near the canal wall, unusual, but not unwelcome. As long as they don't crowd the herbs. You whisper a small apology to a bean you accidentally uproot and tuck it back into the soil with a gentle pat. This is the part of the day that stretches, long and quiet, filled with tiny decisions. Here, every leaf matters. Every bug is a messenger. Every breeze carries hints about tomorrow's weather. It's not a war zone. It's a negotiation. And you, surprisingly, are the diplomat. You finish your weeding, rinse your hands in the canal, and watch as a pair of dragonflies dart across the water, glinting like tiny mirrors. You think about the royal gardens again, the trimmed hedges, the neat rows, the polished stones. But they don't hum like this. They don't buzz with this low, vibrant frequency of life doing what it does best: moving, growing, surviving. As the sun begins to lean toward late afternoon, you walk the length of your chinampa once more. Everything looks better than it did this morning. Not perfect, but balanced. The pests haven't won. The plants are holding strong. The frogs seem pleased with their diet. You nod to yourself, satisfied, and return to your seat at the water's edge. You've managed the chaos for another day, not by eliminating it, but by dancing with it. A weed here, a beetle there, a frog's hungry tongue in between. And as you sit in the fading sun, a single marigold petal detaches in the breeze, floats down, and lands in your lap. You don't brush it away. You take it as a thank you. There's a distant rumble on the horizon, not thunder, not drums, just the low, throaty sound of rain starting somewhere else. You tilt your head, trying to guess the direction. West, probably, over the dry hills beyond the lake. The clouds have been building all day, bloating the air with that humid tension that makes your skin feel like it's sweating even when it's dry. You've been watching the sky while pretending to weed, eyes flicking between your squash and the fast-moving clouds. Something's coming, and in Chinampa country, that something is rarely subtle. You secure your tools and double-check the canoe's mooring, just in case. You've seen what a sudden storm can do, especially if it arrives after a week of full sun, when the beds are dry and the soil light. That's how it starts: a little wind, a little rise in water level. Then poof! Your garden lifts off like it's trying to escape. Here's your historical fact that might raise an eyebrow. Yes, chinampas sometimes floated away. Despite all the stabilizing ahuejote trees, reed mats, and careful anchoring, a particularly bad storm or unexpected flood surge could lift the edges of a less secure bed and set it adrift. Floating wasn't a metaphor in these cases, it was a mild disaster. You'd wake up to find your peppers in the wrong canal, your neighbor's herbs nestled where your tomatoes used to be, and several willow poles mysteriously absent. A gardening version of musical chairs, only messier. You remember a story your uncle told when you were little, of the time a section of his neighbor's bed broke loose and drifted halfway across the lake. It had to be paddled back like a wayward raft. It took 2 canoes and a shouting match, he said. And one very confused dog. You laugh now, remembering it. But the truth is, it happens. Chinampas walk the line between stability and surrender. They hold, until they don't. You inspect your corners again, kneeling at the far end of the plot. The soil's damp but compact. The ahuejotes are drinking deep, their roots gripping the waterlogged edges like fists. Still, you decide to hedge your bets. You add a few more reed bundles to the perimeter and reinforce a soft corner with extra mud from the canal. It's tedious work, but you'd rather sweat now than float tomorrow. And here's your quirky fringe tidbit. Some Chinampa farmers made storm charms by tying together corn husks and chili pods, hanging them from willow branches to discourage the beds from lifting during heavy rains. No one truly believed the charms held back the wind, but maybe, just maybe, they reminded the garden to stay put. You're not above such things. You tie one yourself, 3 husks and a dried pepper, and let it sway in the breeze like a silent wish. Let's wade into the debate for today's stormy mood. Historians still argue whether Chinampa drifting was a rare anomaly or a seasonal inevitability. Some records speak of reinforced foundations that lasted decades without shifting. Others mention entire zones requiring annual realignment after the rainy season. It may have depended on location, care, or sheer luck. But one thing is certain: the risk never fully disappeared. You pause and listen again. The wind has picked up. The water in the canal is moving faster, pulling leaves and debris along in a lazy spiral. A pair of ducks squawk and take off, flapping toward shelter. You squint up at the clouds. The light has changed, sharpened. The sky isn't gray. It's silver, threaded with threads of yellow and green like bruised fruit. You sigh and decide to wait it out. There's no point in panicking. You sit beneath your tallest willow, pack your tools tight, and wrap your woven cloak around your shoulders. If the storm comes, it comes. The Chinampa will hold, or it won't. But you've done what you could. And maybe that's the point of this place, this whole floating life. You can't control the weather, or the lake, or the will of the gods who may or may not be watching. But you can tie the ropes tighter. You can shovel more mud. You can check the tree roots and whisper to your squash and hang a charm in the wind and hope. You hear the first drops before you feel them. Soft at first, almost gentle, then faster, louder, filling the air with a rhythm that overtakes your thoughts. The canal shivers. The marigolds bend. The frogs fall silent. For a moment, everything stills. Then the storm arrives in full. Rain slashes sideways. Wind kicks across the surface. The Chinampa groans beneath you, not audibly, but in that subtle, shifting way you've learned to detect. The water level rises fast. You sit very still, breathing with the storm, eyes half closed, trusting your knots, your tree roots, your hands. And when it passes, 20 minutes later, as suddenly as it came, the air is cooler. The canal is wider, and your bed is still here. You let out a long, slow breath and reach up to touch the storm charm. It's soaked, but it held. You'll reset the perimeter tomorrow. Dredge more soil, anchor the reed mats again. But for now, you lie back on the damp earth, eyes wide to the washed clean sky. The Chinampa floated, but it stayed, just like you. It's the morning after the storm, and everything smells like wet leaves, silt, and beans. You blink awake, stretch your arms, and sit up to the sound of a heron squawking from a nearby willow like it's chastising the sunrise. The air is heavy and soft, the light filtered through last night's leftover clouds. Your Chinampa is still here, thank the gods, but it looks like it's had a rough evening. One tomato vine is flattened. A corner of your maize row is slightly tilted. And, most bizarre of all, there is a heron-sized surprise splattered dead center across your young bean plants. Yes, that's right, a heron has pooped on your beans. You stare at it, it stares back, then it flaps away, completely unbothered, leaving you with the unenviable task of deciding what counts as an agricultural blessing and what's just rude. Welcome to the wonderfully strange intersection of farming, superstition, and sanitation. Here's your core historical fact, not quite as glamorous as temple building but infinitely more useful when you're elbow deep in muck. Aztec Chinampa farmers maintained extremely strict cleanliness standards, especially because their agricultural system relied so heavily on water. Contamination of the canals wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Polluted water could harm plants, spoil fish yields, or breed disease. As a result, farmers kept designated zones for waste, avoided bathing near food plots, and even had rules about where animals could be allowed to roam. The lake was sacred, but it was also functional, and they treated it accordingly. You grab a wooden scoop and gently clear the worst of the mess. The beans, miraculously, seem unbothered, flexing upward like nothing happened. Still, you mutter a few half-serious apologies to the plant, just in case. And here's your fringe tidbit of the day. Some farmers believed that bird droppings, under the right circumstances, were a good omen. If a heron relieved itself on your garden before a planting, it was considered a sign that the gods were watching, albeit in a rather undignified fashion. One scribe recorded a gardener who refused to wash a soil patch after such an event, claiming it was now favored by the wind gods. You suppose that's one way to frame it. You move through the garden slowly, inspecting the aftermath of the storm. The squash is fine. The maize just needs a little propping. The canals are running fast but not flooded. In the distance, you see another farmer using a long-handled rake to pull a half-submerged reed mat back to its proper place. He waves at you with the kind of tired enthusiasm that only comes from managing a disaster before breakfast. As you work, you think about the way belief and biology constantly overlap here on the Chinampas. You're not just tending plants. You're tending meaning. That's why you offered incense last week before the new planting. That's why you always avoid harvesting on certain moon phases. That's why you find yourself whispering to your beans, not because they can hear, but because you can hear yourself. And while you're on that note, let's dive into today's scholarly debate. Historians continue to discuss the degree to which Aztec agricultural rituals were grounded in spiritual belief versus practical tradition. Were these rules and observances born of genuine cosmology, or were they encoded wisdom disguised as worship? Was the avoidance of waste in canals a public health decision or a spiritual taboo? Most agree it was both. In Aztec life, spiritual logic and scientific outcome walked hand in hand. You finish inspecting your plot and decide the damage isn't bad. In fact, the rain might have done some good. The soil is rich and dark, the marigold's upright again, and the canal is clearing itself nicely. You untie the charm you hung yesterday, now soggy and sagging, and toss it into the compost basket. Its work is done. From your canoe, you grab a gourd of fresh water and take a slow sip. The lake is calm again. Dragonflies return to their post above the beans. A turtle peeks from the canal and regards you like a mildly interested neighbor. You paddle out toward a nearby chinampa where your friend Matlal waits with a bundle of herbs. You're trading today, some of your tomatoes for his epazote and chilies. It's the usual exchange, nothing fancy, but that's the point. Farming here isn't just growing, it's relating. To neighbors, to gods, to bugs, to birds that can't aim. When you arrive, Matlal gestures at the faint smear of white across your shoulder. That yours? He asks, grinning. The herons, you reply. We're closer than ever. He laughs and hands you the herbs. You pass him the tomatoes. No coins are exchanged, just nods. That's enough. The transaction feels older than money, like something built into the soil itself. You paddle back slowly, the wind in your face now, rippling the water and sending a few loose marigold petals skimming like tiny boats across the surface. You're tired, but the good kind. The kind that comes from cleaning up a mess and finding, beneath it, a little resilience. A little humor. A beanstalk that still stands tall, even with bird blessings on its leaves. You dock your canoe, return to your plot, and sit cross-legged beneath your favorite willow. The storm is gone, the plants are upright, the frogs are singing again. You did what you had to. And tomorrow, with luck, the birds will aim elsewhere. The sun is soft and low, a golden disk smeared across the edge of the lake, and you're back on your chinampa, hands stained with damp earth and mind humming with the quiet rhythm of a job that never really ends. But today's task isn't planting or propping or dodging rogue herons. It's something slower, something quieter, something just a little strange. Digging without digging. That's right, out here on the floating gardens, where your crops grow in waterlogged rafts and the soil shifts with every gust of wind, you don't dig in the usual sense. You nudge, you scoop, you coax. Traditional farming tools, plows, hoes, spades, don't work the way they do on dry land. Use one with too much enthusiasm, and you'll tear up your own garden bed like a toddler in a sandbox. No, chinampa farming requires finesse, and a very good sense of balance. You crouch by your patch of young beans and lift your tool of the day. A long-handled paddle rake with wide wooden prongs and a flat back, used not to pierce the soil, but to stroke it. Think of it like petting your garden. You use it to gently turn the top few inches of soil, loosening any algae film, disrupting weeds before they get cocky, and mixing in yesterday's scoop of silt. It's not glamorous work, it's not fast, but it's how your bed breathes. Here's your core historical insight. Chinampa farmers developed a set of lightweight, water-friendly tools uniquely suited to their soggy environment. These included scoops for silt, flat-edged paddles for mixing soil layers, and narrow forks carved from wood or bone to plant seeds with precision. Tools were extensions of hands, not replacements. They were about feel, not force. You used them not to dominate the land, but to ask politely. You drag your rake through the bean row now, barely disturbing the roots, and pause to wipe your brow. A dragonfly settles on the handle for a moment before darting off toward the maze. You smile. Even the insects respect the choreography here. Let's pause for your offbeat fact of the day. Archaeological finds from chinampa zones include strange, spatula-like tools whose use puzzled early historians, until they realized these implements were designed for wetland agriculture. Their wide, flat shape would be useless in dry, packed earth but perfect for smoothing the surface of a floating plot. Some even have grooves along one edge, perhaps for shaping seed trenches, perhaps for decoration. Historians still argue about that part. You move to your amaranth patch, rake over the topsoil there, and use a split stick to plant a few new seeds. It's gentle work, you don't press too deep. Just enough to whisper the idea of growth into the dirt. Then you cover them lightly, pat the soil down with your palm, and move on. Across the canal, your neighbor is doing the same. Her rake has a narrower head, better for herbs. She's kneeling, not crouching, her hands moving like she's kneading dough. There's something calming about the sight of someone else going through the same motions, different seeds, same dance. Now for the scholarly debate of the day. Were chinampa tools standardized across regions, or did each farmer craft their own, shaped by tradition and whim? Some surviving tools suggest common designs, similar lengths, similar curves, but others are wildly personal. Carved handles, decorative notches, carved animal heads at the base. It seems likely that tools were shared, traded, and handed down, much like songs or soup recipes. Each one a kind of wooden diary. You take a break, sit on the edge of your plot, feet dangling just above the water, and run your fingers along the handle of your own rake. It's smooth with years of use, the grip polished by your palms. There's a nick near the base, your grandfather's doing, from the time he tried to fend off a particularly aggressive goose. You've never repaired it, you like the reminder. And here's something poetic to carry with you into the dusk. You're not just tending a garden, you're shaping softness. These beds don't respond to force. They reward attention, patience, a kind of careful insistence that most people forget exists. You can't stomp through a chinampa. You have to move like you're part of it, as if the soil remembers every footprint, as if the water might hold a grudge. You return to your rake, touch the beans again, check the squash leaves for bugs. All is well. The soil is light, rich, slightly damp. The canal is clear. The frogs are singing their off-key chorus. A breeze lifts your hair and the scent of basil drifts through the air like a soft sigh. You finish the last row as the light fades to lavender. The rake is warm from your hands now, the dirt clinging to your nails cool and dark. You clean your tools with lake water, dry them with the hem of your tunic, and stow them in your canoe, where they'll rest until the morning. The work is done for today. But the softness you've made? It stays. The moon is still tucked behind the mountains when you wake. It's the kind of early that makes sound echo. A frog's croak feels louder, a paddle's splash sharper. But this morning isn't just another sleepy start on the chinampa. Today's different. You reach for the bundle at your bedside, a roll of cloth dyed with crushed cochineal and bound with a strip of maize husk. Inside, carefully arranged, are your offerings: 3 marigold blossoms, a few kernels of dried maize, a tiny carved mask no bigger than your thumb. Today, you'll place them by the water's edge, because today is for the gods. You paddle slowly through the canal as the sky lightens from indigo to gray. On the surface of the water, you see mirrored stars trembling with your motion. There's a hush in the air, a thick stillness like a held breath. You're not alone in this ritual. Others are emerging too. One man stands knee-deep in the canal, rubbing his arms with lake water. A woman to your left murmurs a prayer while scattering flower petals over her beans. The chinampas are quiet, but the presence is palpable. Here's your central historical truth for today's reverent journey. Aztec agriculture, especially chinampa farming, was deeply entwined with spiritual ritual, honoring gods who governed rain, fertility, growth, and decay. Every planting, every harvest, every storm, every drought, each moment in the cycle of food, was touched by the divine. You didn't just farm for survival. You farmed in partnership with the gods, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with fear. You arrive at the southern edge of your bed, the one closest to the open lake, where your ahuejote trees bend low over the water. It's where you always place your offerings. You kneel and unroll your cloth. The marigolds go down first, then the maize, then the mask, its tiny features frowning eternally, as if preemptively disappointed. You light a twist of copal resin, and as the smoke spirals upward, you whisper a name, Talak. Here's your open scholarly debate for the day. Was Talak primarily a god of rain, or also of agricultural memory, of soil, silt, and cycles? Some scholars argue he represented more than just weather. He was the keeper of watery knowledge, of everything that flowed and decayed and returned. To farmers, especially those living in the marshlands, He was both friend and threat. A bringer of life and a sudden destroyer. In Chinampa life, where a gentle rain could be salvation and a flood meant your garden floated off to nowhere, talak mattered. You close your eyes as the copal burns, breathing deep. The smoke smells like wet bark and old stone. You don't say anything elaborate. Just thanks. Just please let the squash survive the next storm. Just remember me when it's time to flood, and do it gently. You finish the ritual quietly, pack away the cloth, and return to your bed. It feels different now, heavier, in the good way. Anchored not just by willow roots, but by intention. Now for your fringe detail, one of those stories that sticks in your teeth. Some Chinampa farmers believed certain gods lived beneath the canals themselves. Not above, below, spirits of drowned ancestors, forgotten deities or serpents that carried the roots of maize through the water. There's a story of one man who claimed to hear whispers in the mud each time he dug silt. He left honey cakes at the corners of his beds, just in case. You've never heard whispers yourself, but you've felt the soil pulse once or twice, like something was breathing beneath it. You move through your tasks slowly today, eyes drawn to the sky more often than usual. You're watching for signs, a double bird call, a cloud shaped like a maize leaf, a ripple that moves against the wind. You know it's silly, but you also know that for hundreds of years, farmers out here read the world like a codex. And sometimes, they were right. As you bend to check your squash blossoms, you murmur a little blessing. Not formal, not practiced, just words that feel like gratitude. The bees arrive soon after. You take it as a good sign. By late morning, the others are gathering across the water. A small procession, priests in white, carrying offerings in bowls, walking slowly across the causeway toward the temple at the edge of the Chinampa zone. It's not a public festival, but it's something. A minor feast day for Xochipilli, the god of flowers, song, and, conveniently, fertile soil. You pause your work, dust your hands, and paddle closer, just to listen. They chant in low voices, more hum than word. Offerings are placed at the water's edge, flower garlands, ears of maize, strings of amaranth, painted gourds. A flute plays, shrill and wavering, and someone scatters crushed petals into the canal. It looks like the lake is bleeding color. And for a brief moment, everything pauses. You, the other farmers, the ducks, the fish, even the wind. Then it passes. The priests finish. The offerings float. The canal accepts them with its usual quiet grace. You return to your garden with something you didn't have this morning. Not certainty, not magic. Just a feeling that maybe this plot, this floating patch of roots and mud and memory, is seen. Not just by your neighbors or the frogs, but by something else. Something old, something that remembers every offering, every whispered name, every seed buried with hope. You resume your weeding. The garden, now touched by smoke and song, seems to hum a little louder. The midday heat comes on fast, pressing into your shoulders like a heavy hand and turning the air thick enough to taste. The garden slows with it. Even the squash vines seem to sigh under their own weight, their wide leaves wilted in a lazy sprawl. The only thing moving with any energy is you, and only because it's time to gather your harvest tribute for the temple. Yes, the temple gets first dibs. Always has. You don't complain. It's part of the deal. The gods bring rain, keep the sun from melting your crops, protect your plot from floods. Well, most of the time, and in return, you send them the first, the best, and sometimes the weirdest of what you grow. Today, that means a bundle of your tallest maize, a squash the size of a small drum, and a handful of red chilies so hot they once made a priest sneeze in the middle of a ceremony. You were scolded, then asked for more. Here's your core historical fact. Aztec farmers, including chinampa growers, were required to contribute agricultural tribute to local temples and religious officials, who used these offerings in ceremonies, public feasts, and symbolic displays. It was an honor and a duty, a way to align the daily work of growing food with the spiritual currents of the empire. Tribute might be scheduled, or it might be spontaneous, especially after a good harvest or a close call with drought. You bundle your offerings in woven cloth and stack them carefully in the front of your canoe. The squash goes in last, it's so round it keeps trying to roll. You eventually wedge it in with a few rocks and a silent prayer. Then, paddle in hand, you begin the slow glide across the canal toward the temple docks. As you drift, you see others doing the same. A canoe glides past, carrying nothing but flowers, thick orange marigolds, white lilies, and long ropes of bougainvillea. Another passes with small jars of honey and a pyramid of tamales wrapped in banana leaves. The mood isn't heavy, it's not forced, it's rhythmic, just part of the cycle. You reach the docks and are greeted by two young attendants in white tunics, barefoot and focused. They help you unload, and you bow slightly as they lift the maize bundle with both hands, as if it weighs more than it does. The squash earns an impressed nod. You try not to beam too obviously. And here's your fringe tidbit. The first produce offered to the temple was often painted before being displayed. Not with heavy pigments, but with natural dyes, annatto, cochineal, even powdered gold in special cases. A tomato might be dusted with red powder, a squash with lines of white chalk. These weren't decorations, they were messages, symbols, a visual offering layered on top of the physical one. You once tried painting a particularly symmetrical chili red and gold. It was rejected for being too spicy for the moon gods. You haven't painted since. Inside the temple courtyard, the offerings are arranged in wide shallow trays, sorted by type. You spot your squash near the front, now surrounded by candles and garlands. It looks proud. You nod to it once and turn back to your canoe. Now for the scholarly debate of the hour. Historians still discuss how centralized the tribute collection from chinampas was. Was it temple managed, empire managed, or left to local priests? Some records describe detailed collection rosters, with quotas and punishments for missed deliveries. Others suggest a more flexible system, guided by seasonal abundance and community festivals. The truth likely varies from district to district. But one thing is clear: someone always got the first bite. Back on your plot, the garden hasn't noticed your absence. The amaranth nods in the breeze. The bees resume their lazy circuits around the marigolds, and your frog chorus continues in full voice, unbothered, as always. You kneel near your maize rows and check for signs of worms. None today. That's tribute enough. And here's something soft to take with you into the slow roll of the afternoon. Giving food before you eat it yourself rewires the way you see it. It becomes more than nutrition. More than trade. It becomes an expression, a conversation. You grow not just to feed, but to thank. Even if the gods aren't hungry, even if they never notice your painted tomato, you notice. And somehow, that's enough. You return to work with a little more lightness in your step. The tribute is done. The temple is fed. Your squash now lives in a sacred courtyard. And you still have plenty left to eat. You sit down beneath the ahuejote tree at the corner of your bed, peel a roasted chili from your pouch, and bite in slowly. The heat creeps across your tongue, then fades into something familiar. Something good. Tomorrow, the gods will ask again. And you'll answer. The sky this evening is brushed with rose and ash, the kind of color that makes the canal look like it's blushing under the weight of twilight. You've finished the day's tending, wiped your hands on your tunic, and tied up your canoe, but you're not heading home yet. Tonight, you're staying a while longer. Because tonight isn't about crops or rain or herons behaving badly. Tonight is about memory, ceremony, loss. Tonight, your chinampa becomes more than a garden. It becomes a place to say goodbye. You're preparing a small altar at the far edge of your bed, near the roots of the oldest willow. It's the spot your mother used to sit when she visited, back before her hands trembled and her eyes grew cloudy. You've cleared a patch of earth, swept the damp soil clean, and laid down a mat of woven reeds. On it, you place marigolds, a carved obsidian mirror, and a little bowl of tamales, still warm. You light a taper of resin and watch the smoke coil upward, soft and slow, like breath in reverse. Here's your core historical fact. Chinampas weren't just places of food. They were woven into the rituals of life, death, and healing. The Aztecs used them not only to grow sustenance, but also to gather herbs for medicine, flowers for ceremonies, and offerings for funerals. Some families even held wakes on their plots, setting up floating altars, singing songs, and releasing votive candles into the water at dusk. Floating gardens became floating memorials, rooted and drifting all at once. You kneel beside the altar and take out the tiny clay flute your father made when he was young. It doesn't sound like much when you play it, more wheeze than melody, but you blow softly into it anyway. The tune is a lullaby, one you barely remember the words to. That's fine, the chinampa remembers. And here's your offbeat tidbit. There's evidence that some funeral boats were launched from chinampa canals, carrying offerings and the ashes of loved ones into the wider lake. These weren't grand, state-sponsored ceremonies. These were personal, intimate departures. One story tells of a gardener who carved a canoe entirely from a huejote wood and filled it with marigolds, then sent it off alone at dawn. Whether anyone watched it reach the far shore was beside the point. The lake saw it. You light another stick of copal. The smoke mingles with the scent of wet basil and squash leaves, and something about it catches in your throat, not from the smoke, but from the weight of everything this place holds. The food, the hours, the stories, the silences. Your neighbor across the canal does the same. You see her altar, a row of candles beside a bunch of lilies and a pair of clay figurines. You exchange a nod, no words. These moments don't need commentary. Just presence. Now for today's scholarly murmurings. Historians still puzzle over the degree to which chinampas were used for ritual versus practicality. Were these funerary and healing moments exceptions, or were they seamlessly part of the garden's purpose? Was every harvest a prayer? Was every weed pulled also an act of reverence? The written records are patchy. The truth might be that these floating gardens held everything at once: work, worship, wonder, and grief, layered together like silt and reed mats. The night grows thicker. The stars begin to pierce through the purple. You sit back, stretch your legs, and place one last tamale on the mat, your mother's favorite, filled with pumpkin seed and herbs. You smile. You tell her a story. About a squash vine that wouldn't grow until you whispered to it. About a frog who claimed your canoe as his second home. About the time you saw a priest trip on a root and pretend it was a dance. You laugh softly, alone, but not lonely. When the candle burns low, you rise. The altar will stay until dawn. The lake will keep it safe. And here's something to carry with you. Grief on a chinampa is not a pause. It's part of the cycle. The soil remembers. The water reflects. The plants bloom again, but not without knowing what came before. You plant your seeds in the same spot where you once cried. You eat the tomatoes that grew beside the offering bowl. You sing the same lullaby to your squash and your ghosts. You step into your canoe and push off gently, the paddle barely making a sound. Behind you, your altar flickers, steady and small. The lake is quiet, the chinampa sleeps, and your memories drift, not away, but with you. By the time the sun has climbed well above the mountains and the willows begin casting shadows sharp enough to mark the hour, you find yourself in the middle of a quiet disagreement. Not a fight, exactly. No one raises their voice. But a neighbor 2 plots over insists you've been drawing more water than your share from the shared canal. You blink, gesture toward your bean vines, still damp from dew, and try to explain that you haven't opened your sluice in days. But he's already pointing to his lower bed, where the soil is cracked, the marigolds are limp, and the frogs have apparently migrated to yours. Welcome to water politics, chinampa style. Here's your core historical fact. Even in a system as cooperative as chinampa farming, water rights were a hot topic. The Aztecs developed intricate local networks of canals, dikes, and sluice gates to manage water flow across vast floating fields, but they also had to rely on each other. A blocked canal upstream could flood an entire bed. A diverted flow could dry out 3 more. And since everything was connected, literally, through water, a bad decision in one plot could ripple outward fast. You set your paddle aside and walk the edge of your bed, inviting your neighbor to inspect the canal himself. He does, slowly, grumbling. He pokes the water with his pole, tests the flow, examines your spillways, and eventually, reluctantly, concedes that it's not your fault. Maybe the ahuejotes took more than usual, he mutters. You nod, even though you know perfectly well those trees haven't grown new roots overnight. Sometimes, a peaceful resolution needs a willing scapegoat. Today, the willows take the blame. And here's your fringe tidbit. Disputes over chinampa water weren't always settled with diplomacy. Some were handled through ritual appeals. Farmers might leave offerings at canal intersections, bundles of herbs, clay figures, or even folded corn husks marked with ink, to ask the spirits of the water to adjust the balance. One story tells of a woman who blamed her neighbor for drought and floated a small raft of chili powder and fish bones downstream. He had nightmares for a week and started redirecting water the next day. You patch a soft spot in your bank with some fresh mud, still thinking about the morning's tension. The water levels have dropped slightly this week. Maybe it's the moon, maybe it's upstream dredging, or maybe, just maybe, the gods are stirring. That brings us to today's scholarly murmur. Historians still argue how formalized water distribution was among chinampa zones. Some evidence points to local councils or appointed officials overseeing flow rates, opening and closing sluices on a set schedule. Others suggest the system was more honor-bound, neighbors cooperating because they had to, with no overseer but mutual need and shared consequence. The truth probably flexed over time, depending on politics, rainfall, and just how good the last chili harvest was. You paddle a little farther down the canal to check the junction where your bed meets 2 others. The reeds here grow thick, and someone's built a small wooden weir to slow the current. It's clever, slows erosion, traps silt, but it also backs water into your plot when the wind shifts. You make a note to talk to the owner about adjusting it. Gently, after tamales, maybe with a gift of beans. As you drift back to your bed, you pass another farmer, an older woman with gray hair tied in 2 long braids, her canoe piled high with squash. She nods. "Water good today?" "Good enough," you reply. She laughs. "It never stays that way." And there it is, the heart of it. Water here is never yours. It passes through. You can nudge it, borrow it, ask it to linger. But you can't own it. The chinampa knows that. The trees know that. The frogs definitely know that. Back on your plot, you check your spillways once more, then settle beneath the shade of your ahuejote and sip tamarind water from a gourd. The canal beside you laps quietly, reflecting the rustling canopy above. Somewhere in the shallows, a fish breaks the surface. You glance sideways. Your neighbor's plot looks a little wetter now. Maybe the water remembered its way. Maybe the frogs made a good argument. You lean back, letting your legs stretch out across the cool soil, and consider carving a little marker stone for your plot, not to claim it, but just to honor it. A symbol, a reminder, that this space is both yours and not yours. That what feeds your beans also feeds your neighbor's chilies. That the water doesn't care whose hand dug the canal. It just moves. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it leaves you enough for the squash and the frogs. The wind arrives from the east today, strong enough to ruffle your hair and tilt the tallest maize stalks at a curious angle. The surface of the canal is all ripples and shifting light, like a woven mat being unspooled across the lake. It's a working wind, good for drying squash leaves and clearing out stagnant corners. But it also brings a fine dust from the valley rim, and with it, the faint, familiar hum of song. Not a farmer's tune, not a priest's chant, but a vendor's voice, bright, rhythmic, and unmistakable. Which means it's time for the floating market. Here's your core historical fact to anchor this lovely image. The Aztecs operated not only large, centralized marketplaces like Tlatelolco, but also mobile or floating markets. Informal, often seasonal gatherings where chinampa farmers and lake dwellers traded goods by boat. These markets popped up like lilies on the water, organized by mutual need, ritual timing, or just the collective itch to trade, chat, and swap stories. Canoes would cluster together, tied in loose groups, with their owners calling out what they had to offer. You don't need much today, just a spool of fresh palm fiber twine and maybe a better digging paddle, if anyone has one not split down the middle. But you paddle toward the gathering anyway, drawn less by necessity and more by curiosity. There's something comforting about a floating market. It's messier than the city plazas, but friendlier. You recognize most of the voices before you even see the faces. You arrive at the bend where the canals widen and see it. A lazy constellation of tied-up boats, each one bobbing gently in its own space. One is stacked high with baskets of prickly pears. Another displays fresh fish on banana leaves. A third boasts what appear to be nothing but dried gourds painted with faces. Useful? Unclear. Charming? Absolutely. And here's your quirky fringe tidbit. Some chinampa farmers brought their children to the floating markets not just to help, but to learn the songs of trade. Yes, songs. Vendors would sing their offerings. Chili red, still warm from sun, or green leaves for sleep, for sorrow, for strength. Each seller developed their own tune, hardly to attract attention, partly because it was easier to shout in rhythm over the water. The result was a kind of floating choir, where commerce and music danced together. You tie your canoe to an elders and step across into the shared space. There's no formal layout, no tidy aisles. You just drift from boat to boat, nodding, greeting, examining a gourd here, a bundle of chives there. Someone offers you roasted grasshoppers on a woven plate. You take two, mostly to be polite. They're crunchy, spicy, and far better than you remembered. You find your twine, a good coil, still warm from the sun, and trade for it with a handful of dried tomatoes. The vendor grins and throws in a carved whistle shaped like a frog, for luck. You accept it. Why not? If you're going to farm in a swamp, you might as well whistle like the locals. And here's the debate of the day. Historians still question how formalized these floating markets were. Were they overseen by tribute officials, or were they truly grassroots gatherings? Some evidence suggests temple guards occasionally passed through, ensuring fair trades and watching for tax evasion. Others argue these events were largely unregulated, built on trust and reputation. The truth is likely both. Some days you bartered freely, other days you caught the eye of a priest who suddenly remembered you hadn't paid your cacao quota. You spot a carved paddle in one of the corner boats, sturdy, well-balanced, and cleanly etched with a serpent motif. You test the weight, nod with approval, and trade 2 ears of early maize and a packet of chili salt for it. The seller winks. That one floats better than you do, she says. You laugh, and admit it's probably true. By the time you make your way back to your canoe, the wind has shifted again, cooler now, laced with lake scent and smoke from a fire somewhere downstream. You untie your line and push off, your new paddle cutting clean through the current. As you drift back toward your chinampa, the music of the market fades behind you. Just birds now, and frogs, and the low creak of trees. And here's the soft insight to carry home. These floating markets weren't just economic, they were emotional. A place to connect, to gossip, to trade more than goods. You brought your stories as much as your squash. You returned with jokes, favors, new twine, and sometimes, a frog-shaped whistle that chirped if you blew it just right. Back at your plot, you unpack your finds. The twine goes on the shelf. The paddle leans beside the canoe. The frog whistle? You try it. It squeaks. A real frog answers from the canal. You smile. The trade was good. And tomorrow, when the sun rises again, you'll plant with a paddle that tells stories and tie your maize with twine that once sang on the lake. The sky is a soft pewter this morning, heavy with the weight of unseen clouds that might bring rain, or might not. That's the gamble. Every chinampa farmer knows this particular suspense, when the air smells like water but refuses to deliver. So, you move through your morning slowly, watching the wind, reading the sky, and listening to the lake, as if it might whisper its plans. Today's not for weeding or planting. Today, you're preparing seed balls. Here's your core historical fact. Chinampa farmers practiced advanced seed management techniques to ensure consistent crops and reduce waste, including the use of seed balls, small clumps of clay mixed with soil, compost, and seeds that could be planted without scattering or blowing away. Especially useful during breezy days or when the soil was still drying from last week's rain. These little spheres were dropped directly onto the surface, where they slowly dissolved with the next moisture and took root exactly where they landed. No digging, no precise poking, just placement and patience. You sit cross-legged in the middle of your plot, a bowl of soft clay beside you. your fingers already stained brown and red. One by one, you roll seeds into little lumps: amaranth, beans, squash, even a few experimental chilies that your cousin swears will grow short and stout if started this way. Your palms are rhythmic, like grinding maize, like shaping tamales. This is old work, quiet work, and here's a beautifully odd fringe tidbit. Some Chinampa farmers decorated their seed balls with tiny carvings or pressed designs, spirals, leaf shapes, sun symbols, not for aesthetics, but as a kind of blessing or memory tag. One carving meant planted during storm season. Another meant harvested after the eclipse. A few even included symbols from dreams, signs only the farmer who made them could interpret. A coded language of clay and hope. You pause, press your thumb into one seed ball, and leave a soft spiral. You don't know what it means exactly, but it feels right. By midday, you've made nearly 100 of them, neatly lined up on a mat to dry. You'll plant them tomorrow, unless the rain comes first and the lake gets too high. In that case, you'll paddle around dropping them gently by hand into the raised beds like little gifts. You stretch your legs, wash your hands in the canal, and eat your midday meal: tortillas, a smear of chili paste, a few beans. You sit beneath the ahuejote tree with the breeze at your back, and your eyes scanning the horizon. Still no rain, just sky holding its breath. Let's drift now into a debate. Historians still discuss whether the seed ball technique was indigenous to Chinampa zones or introduced through trade or observation from other regions. Some claim the method originated in highland farming, where wind and erosion made traditional sowing difficult. Others argue it was born from necessity here on the lake, as Chinampa farmers looked for ways to simplify planting in soft, floating soil. The truth might lie in both places. An idea floated across landscapes, rooted wherever it made sense. After your meal, you return to your clay. You still have enough for 20 more. You mix in a bit of dried silt, just to firm the balls, and hum a little tune you don't quite remember learning. Your hands know it, that's enough. As the sun begins its slow descent, you walk the rows and find good spots for tomorrow's planting. You touch the soil, gauge the moisture, look for frog tracks, which, by the way, usually mean good drainage. You mark the corners with twigs and mutter to yourself about spacing. No one listens, except maybe the squash. And here's a final softness to hold tonight. Planting like this isn't about control, it's about trust. You shape your little clay worlds, tuck seeds inside, and let them go. No guarantee, no schedule, just the belief that tomorrow, or the day after, the clay will crumble, and something green will stretch toward the light. You gather your seed balls, carry them into your storage hut, and place them on a flat stone shelf to finish drying overnight. Outside, the air is thicker now. Closer. One drop of rain hits your shoulder. Then another. Then silence. You look up, smile. The lake has made its decision. Tomorrow, the clay will open. And the garden will listen. It rained overnight. Not a storm, no drama, no flooding, no wind-whipped trees, but a long, gentle fall of water that lasted until the moon ducked behind the clouds and the frogs croaked themselves hoarse. You wake to that unmistakable scent: earth, wet leaves, and lake silt stirred back to life. The air is thick, but cool. The soil is soft without sagging. It is, in short, a perfect morning for planting your seed balls. You don't rush. You eat slowly. You paddle carefully. You let the lake greet you on its own terms. gliding across water still freckled with raindrops and the occasional floating petal. When you reach your chinampa, the garden looks as though it's exhaled during the night. The beans are perkier, the amaranth glistens, the squash leaves wear beads of water like jewelry. You step onto the soil, gently, reverently. Then, one by one, you begin placing your seed balls. Here's your historical anchor for today. Chinampa plots, thanks to their consistent moisture levels and soft, well-aerated soil, were particularly well suited to techniques like direct surface seeding and seed ball planting. Farmers took advantage of the lake's rhythm, rising and falling, saturating and drying, to time their sowing precisely. There was no mechanical plow, no metal blade, just fingers, clay, water, and wisdom. You place each seed ball with care, tucking them between existing rows, nestling them beside marigolds, or slipping them into corners where the squash vines haven't quite spread. Some you drop lightly into shallow puddles, knowing they'll soften and split within hours. Others you half bury, giving them a little shelter from greedy birds or ambitious frogs. And here's your delightfully odd tidbit. In some regions, farmers added powdered chili or garlic to their seed balls to deter insects and rodents. It worked, mostly. The stories about spicy-mouthed squirrels are probably exaggerated, but the principle was sound. You even tried it once, dusting your amaranth seed balls with crushed chili powder. The seedlings sprouted beautifully, but the frogs avoided that part of the bed for a week. Coincidence? Hard to say. You kneel near the northeast corner of your plot, shaping your last seed ball with extra attention. You press your thumb into its surface and leave a mark, a crescent. Not a symbol of anything, really. Just a reminder that this one was made during the rain, that this one came last. Let's glide into today's debate. Historians still question whether seed ball planting was a standard practice across chinampa zones or something used only in certain microclimates or by certain families. Some argue it was universal during windy seasons or late plantings. Others claim it was a personalized method passed down through specific lineages, often used more for herbs and flowers than for staple crops. The truth, as always, is layered, like clay wrapped around seed wrapped around memory. You rise slowly, brushing damp soil from your knees, and walk the rows with a quiet pride. The beds are full now. Not in a crowded way, but in a ready way. Like pages prepared for writing. Like a song that hasn't started yet. You paddle out briefly to gather more water plants for compost, some duckweed, a few long strands of pond grass. As you glide back, a kingfisher flashes across your path, then perches on your ahuejote tree, head cocked. You nod to it. It does not nod back. Back on the plot, you mulch the spaces between rows, reinforcing the beds with last week's dried reeds. You check the water levels in each canal. You retighten a corner stake. Little things, rituals, each one a promise. I will be here tomorrow. I will look after this. I will wait. And here's a truth that no debate can shake. There's nothing passive about growing on a chinampa. You're not just a farmer. You're a caretaker of a floating fragment of the earth. You work with wind, with mud, with insects, with birds that think your chili vines are their personal nap spots. You learn to listen more than command, to nudge more than insist, and in return, the garden gives. Quietly, generously. Sometimes all at once, sometimes not at all, but it always gives something. The sun climbs higher, the air dries, the soil firms slightly beneath your feet. The seed balls are already softening, already opening. You can't see it, but you feel it, A tremble in the bed, a shift in the roots, a readiness in the air. You sit beneath your favorite willow tree, legs stretched, eyes half closed. The lake glimmers, the frogs sing. Somewhere across the canal, a flute begins to play, off-key and lovely. And you think, not for the first time, that maybe the best part of farming here isn't the harvest. It's the wait. The wind today is barely a breath, a soft nudge on your cheek as you crouch beside the northern edge of your chinampa, watching the first amaranth shoots poke their pale heads through the damp soil. Just 2 days since the rain, and already the clay seed balls have cracked open like tiny eggs. You smile, not big or wide, just the small, private curl of someone who knows how rare it is for something to go exactly as planned. The maize rustles behind you, tall and steady. The marigolds are in bloom again. The squash blossoms have opened with theatrical flair, bees already tumbling clumsily between them. It's a good morning, a soft morning, and today, there's nothing to fix. No tilting rows, no flooding corners, no herons dropping surprises onto your beans. Just time. Time to sit, to listen, to take in what you've built, not just in soil and roots, but in rhythm. In memory. Because here's the truth no textbook will quite admit. You don't really grow things on a chinampa. You coax them, you encourage them, you clear their paths, watch the sky, read the water, and hope they feel like growing. It's a collaboration, a negotiation, a slow, muddy conversation between you and the world. And here's your final core historical fact. The chinampa system was not only one of the most productive agricultural techniques of its time, it was sustainable, regenerative, and astonishingly low impact. Unlike slash and burn or dryland farming, chinampas preserved biodiversity, recycled nutrients, and produced food in staggering quantities for centuries. They fed an empire, quietly, consistently, without collapsing. You trail your hand through the canal beside you, fingertips breaking the surface like oars. The water is warm, the willow roots stretch beneath you like knotted fingers. And above, dragonflies slice the air like blue glass needles. Now for your final debate. Historians still wrestle with why the chinampa system faded after the Spanish arrived. Was it mismanagement? A shift in dietary staples? Urban expansion that paved over canals? Some blame introduced livestock, others cite colonial taxes and forced labor. What's certain is this: the loss wasn't just agricultural. It was ecological, cultural, and personal. A living rhythm was interrupted. A conversation was ended mid-sentence. You sit very still for a moment, hands resting on your knees. You think of everyone who came before you. Those who tied these beds together with reed and prayer, who dredged silt before dawn, who whispered to squash and sang to marigolds and passed tools down through the generations. You think about your grandmother, who taught you how to pack seed balls. Your uncle, who claimed frogs were luckier than priests. Your mother, who called the willows green prayers. They're here, somehow, not just in memory, but in the beds themselves. In the way the soil holds your weight. In the call of the birds who still nest in the canal reeds. In the way the lake never stops moving, but never forgets where it's been. And here's your last fringe detail, soft and strange. Some believe that the chinampas are still alive under modern Mexico City, deep beneath the sprawl of highways and concrete, waiting. Buried canals, lost beds, a drowned garden asleep under centuries. If you dig deep enough, they say, you'll find willow roots where they shouldn't be. Frog bones in the middle of parking lots. The whisper of maize leaves beneath the asphalt. A memory, not quite erased. You lie back in the soil now, arms stretched wide, and stare up at the sky. The clouds drift slowly, like boats. The willow branches sway above you, brushing the breeze like fingers over skin. You breathe deep, the garden breathes with you. The chinampa holds. It always has. And in this floating world of mud and memory, patience and prayer, the act of planting is also the act of remembering. You close your eyes. Let the lake hold you. Let the story rest. Wind down, 300 words. And now, as the garden quiets and the light begins to fade into that soft, gray-blue dusk that turns water to glass, you let the last of your thoughts settle. The frogs begin their evening chorus, gentle, arrhythmic, familiar. A breeze moves through the maze like a hush. Nothing asks anything of you now. Not the squash, not the sky, not even the ghosts that sit softly beside the willow, listening. The lake exhales. The reeds lean. You feel the cool press of soil beneath your fingertips and the echo of the day's rhythm gently slipping away from your bones. The canoe is tied, the tools are clean, the seed balls are nestled in place. Everything has been done that needed doing. Everything else can wait. In the distance, someone is lighting a small fire. You can't see it, but the scent of smoke drifts across the canal and wraps around you like a shawl. Warm, subtle, home. There's nothing left to remember tonight. Only the feeling of floating, not adrift, not lost, but held. Anchored by root and water and time. The world moves slowly here. So can you. Let your breath ease. Let your hands rest. Let your thoughts fade like ripples in a still canal. You are in a garden that knows how to wait. A garden that grows by listening. A garden that does not need to be watched to grow. So sleep, now. The chinampa will hold until morning.